Coming up next, The Crunch with Cam Slater. Conversations with a side of controversy. Every Thursday from 4 p.m, right here on RCR, Reality Check Radio.
People are struggling to have conversations and connect with others that they don't completely agree with on every topic. And I think that's probably the biggest problem that we need to try and solve, is how after all this division and after all this separation do we end up bringing people together again, and what does unity really look like?
New Zealand faces some pretty big issues. First one is COVID and the aftermath. There's no getting away from that. Second is racial division. It's been ginned up and it's dangerous. Another issue that maybe people haven't got their head around yet is digital currency. What form does that take? Is it programmable? Will it be used to manipulate behaviour and patterns of behaviour? Those questions need to be asked and answered.
How can you have fair, open, democratic government by people who are appointed? It's a ridiculous idea. And if that idea is taken to its zenith, then this country is in real trouble, because democracy, one person, one vote, where every vote is of equal value, has got to be the foundation of a modern New Zealand.
What's true, what's not true, how our kids are to be educated. And, I have a great fear for the future. I think we know from history where this could end up.
This is The Crunch with Cam Slater. Conversations with a side of controversy, right here on RCR.
Welcome to The Crunch on Reality Check Radio. I'm your host, Cam Slater, and this is the place we crunch the political issues and cut through the politician's spin. We have another incredible show ahead for you this week. My first guest this afternoon is Real Rukshan Fernando, and we'll be discussing his new career as an independent journalist and how he ended up becoming one of the standout personalities challenging the media narrative in Victoria under the tyranny of Dan Andrews' regime. I then will be talking to Avi Yemeni about his upcoming book launch at Auckland and Wellington, and you'll remember that Avi was banned from entering New Zealand on trumped-up excuses. Well, he's back, and he's here to launch his book from the cancel capital of the world. And my final guest today is Ezra Levant, the rebel commander. Ezra has been battling the Trudeau regime for years now, doggedly challenging the mainstream media and government interference in journalism. Rebel News has made a name for themselves, challenging those elites by sticking cameras in their faces and asking people like Albert Bourla and Klaus Schwab the really hard questions that other media refuse to or won't ask. It's a busy afternoon. We have a lot to get through. I've got a huge mailbag with your important feedback here on RCR. We're in the last few weeks of the election campaign, so let's look at what my buddies have to say about the various party leaders as well. Stay tuned till the end to find out what they have to say about this week's leader and his inconsistencies in his narrative. Don't forget to send comments to inbox@realitycheck.radio or text 2057.
You're listening to The Crunch with Cam Slater, right here on RCR, Reality Check Radio.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another thought-provoking episode of The Crunch on Reality Check Radio. I'm your host, Cam, and we're diving headfirst into a crucial topic that's often overlooked in today's world: the urgent need to shun polarization and revive the art of meaningful conversation. In an era dominated by echo chambers and soundbites, it's become increasingly difficult to engage in civil discourse, especially with those who hold differing viewpoints. And that's exactly what this platform is all about: learning to speak with one another again, even when we vehemently disagree. You see, we've committed ourselves to fostering courageous conversations. And that means welcoming guests from all walks of life, even those with whom we might have profound disagreements. It's easy to preach to the choir, to surround ourselves with people who echo our opinions, but it takes real courage to sit down with someone whose perspective challenges our own. Now, some of you might be wondering why I joined Reality Check Radio in the first place. Well, the answer is simple. It represents a much-needed change in our media landscape. We've heard our hosts talking with politicians advocating for genetic engineering, dentists passionately defending fluoride in water, and leaders from the United Nations associated organizations arguing in favor of 15-minute cities. And guess what? Whilst myself and my co-hosts might disagree with many of those viewpoints, we firmly believe that presenting all sides of every issue is paramount. From day one, our motto has been to tell both sides of the story. And yes, we acknowledge there's always room for improvement, but make no mistake, it's our unwavering goal. Just recently, we received an email from Carolyn expressing her frustration with an interview featuring someone who praised a political figure she strongly disagrees with. She found it unsettling and disappointing. Well, Caroline, I've been waiting for this moment. This is our chance to illustrate what free media genuinely means. The Crunch provides the perfect opportunity to educate our listeners on the essence of open dialogue. If we cater to a particular narrative, then we're no different from the mainstream media outlets we often criticize. And let's be honest, if our audience expects us to hold their specific viewpoint, then they too have succumbed to the same polarization that plagues the media landscape. We're here to provide an open platform, a platform where every voice can be heard, regardless of whether we agree with it or not. It's not our job to tell you what to think. It's our mission to present the spectrum of thoughts and perspectives and leave it to you, our esteemed listeners, to make up your own minds. We firmly believe that the kind of polarization we're witnessing has contributed to the erosion of legacy media, politics, and even society at large. We're here to reverse that trend, one courageous conversation at a time. So, dear listeners, let's embrace the discomfort that comes from hearing opposing viewpoints. Let's engage in meaningful discussions that challenge us to think critically and broaden our horizons. Remember, it's the collision of ideas that sparks innovation and progress. As we continue our exploration of courageous discourse here on Reality Check Radio, it's high time we shed our tendencies to act like petulant and churlish children when faced with opinions that don't align with our own. Learning to engage with those we disagree with is the very essence of this show, and indeed it's a personal principle I hold dear. Our society has fallen into a trap where differing opinions are often met with disdain, ridicule, and even silence. But that's not how we grow as individuals, as a community, or as a society. Reality Check Radio, as well as The Crunch, embodies this ethos by confronting divergent viewpoints head on. It's about transcending the narrow confines of our echo chambers and venturing into the realm of open dialogue. Our mission isn't to convince you that we're right and everyone else is wrong. It's about encouraging you to think critically and make informed judgments for yourself. I have to admit, it's not always an easy path. Dealing with people we disagree with requires patience, understanding, and an open heart. It demands that we listen, truly listen to what the other person is saying, rather than merely formulating our response. It calls for empathy and respect, even when we're discussing subjects that touch our nerves. And in a way, The Crunch is a platform for honing these skills that are indispensable not just for intellectual growth, but for fostering a more compassionate and inclusive society. It's about realizing that no matter how different our perspectives might be, there's always a common ground to be found, or at the very least, a deeper understanding of where the other person is coming from. So as we navigate the airwaves, engaging in conversations that challenge, provoke, and inspire, let's remember that the real measure of our character lies not in how we loudly can shout down those we disagree with, but in how gracefully we can engage with them. Let's choose to rise above the noise and embrace the discomfort of diverse opinions. After all, it's only through these exchanges that we can truly broaden our horizons and collectively move forward. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Keep those radios tuned in and keep your hearts and minds open. This is Cam, reminding you that learning to deal with disagreement is a sign of strength, not weakness. Keep embracing courageous discourse. Rukshan Fernando is also known as Real Rukshan on X and YouTube, and he's a former wedding videographer who, through the lockdowns under Dan Andrews in Melbourne, found his business and livelihood under threat. Outraged by what he was seeing happening, he took his skills to the street and recorded harrowing excesses from the Andrews regime, where police were shooting, pepper spraying and tear gassing citizens for peacefully protesting. He's managed to get past immigration and is in New Zealand to support Avi Yemeni as he launches his book. He's with me now. You made it through customs and immigration this time, Rukshan.
That's right, man. That's right, mate. Good to be on here. I did make it through customs this time. There was no interesting questions asked at the check-in in Melbourne this time around. So good to be here in New Zealand without any issues.
Straight through. And you're having a bit of a holiday first before you hit the book launches on Friday and Saturday?
That's right. Yeah. Just traveling around and exploring a bit of the country. Last time I came was my first time in New Zealand, but I didn't really get to travel around because everything kind of got cut short. But this time I'm spending a bit of time, particularly traveling around the South Island.
You got family with you?
Just my partner, my wife. She's with me, so we're making a little bit of a holiday of this.
Oh, fantastic! Because you've been pretty donkey deep in recording the excesses of the Dan Andrews regime, and it's been pretty intense. So I guess you've been looking forward to a decent holiday.
Yeah, this is actually our first kind of holiday together. So since that stuff went down in 2020, like you said, I've been in the deep end of all of this, and a lot of that happened inadvertently. And since that time, obviously, I started covering other issues in our country as well in terms of politics and a few other overseas trips, but all that ended up being for journalism work, not necessarily for a holiday. So it has taken an interesting twist in my life since all of this kind of stuff went down in Melbourne, or around the world, to be honest, yeah.
Well, New Zealanders might not be totally familiar with you, though, but the awake people are, because we were watching what Dan Andrews was doing while Jacinda Ardern was doing exactly the same thing to us. And, maybe if you just give us a little bit of a background, you were a wedding videographer before the pandemic, weren't you?
That's right. I was happily for about, 12 years at that time, had been happily working in my wedding business. So, and that's a booming market in Australia. And so I'd been very busy with that, very happy. And obviously that all got cut short, which at the beginning of all of it was kind of, in an interesting way, it was like a break almost from working so much. So, a month or so was like, oh, this is kind of interesting, right? And I think a lot of people were in that situation, a month of watching Netflix, whatever it is, and you go back to work. But that's not how it turned out, especially in Melbourne here with these endless lockdowns, so many restrictions. We couldn't leave outside our 5-kilometer radius. Obviously, weddings, any type of thing like funerals, anything that involved human interaction and people was cut out by the government, was cancelled. So, I found myself at home, and I'm someone that likes to obviously work. So this really gave me an opportunity to explore other interests in my life, where some people might have taken up cooking and all this kind of stuff. I took up a passion of my life, which is around independent journalism and using my skills to cover some of the crazy stuff that I saw happening in my city. And that really went from one thing to another when I started going to these protests, because at these protests is really when the people in Melbourne came out onto the streets because they were dissatisfied with what was happening in their city. And that a lot of that had to do with the fact that the governments were not being transparent and they're not being accountable to the people. They were just willy-nilly making mistakes, not apologizing, just going down this path of just, not caring for people like businesses or families, and really just leaving it up to people just to be stuck at home in the blind while they continue to just, rule over us with no end in sight. And as those frustrations boiled over here in Melbourne, I spent a lot of time telling those stories and capturing what was happening out on the streets.
Yeah, and those images that you were live streaming were unprecedented, really, for Australia and New Zealand, where we had a militarized police force. Now, in Victoria, the police carry guns as a matter of course, as a routine. It's on their hip all the time. But this was another level of militarization, wasn't it?
Oh, definitely. This was like, they had these things called Bobcats, which were like almost like, like a Humvee style American militarized vehicle, all decked out in black with cops hanging off it in, wearing military style armor, with these massive, I guess, rifles or weapons of some sort, rolling down the streets to an unarmed population of peaceful Australians, as far as I was seeing, practicing their democratic God-given right in this country, their constitutional rights to express political dissent and, protest, which is something that we do in our nations and something that we pride ourselves in the West. But like you said, the scenes that we were seeing were unprecedented. It's stuff that I would expect, in developing nations, in third world countries, where you have these military juntas just ruling over people and, shutting down all forms of dissent. Here we are seeing it in our countries, and it was just very, very confronting is probably the word. And, the first time it really hit me really hard was when I saw these weapons being used against protesters who were unarmed. They were firing these rubber pellets or whatever they were firing at people. But just the fact that they were firing at people in Melbourne, in front of our, iconic Flinders Street station there, the police just started opening up fire on protesters. And it was just crazy scenes that I'd never expected to see in Melbourne, of all places.
Yeah, I used to live in Melbourne, and so I know that area really, really well. And, normally it's the hub. Everyone gets off the train at Flinders Station and walks to where they're going, and it's a vibrant city and all that. And we had this ghost town, but with people protesting and saying, enough's enough, we've had enough of this. And then the strong arm of the state literally coming in and shooting at people, walloping them, tear gassing them, pepper spraying them.
Yeah, and it was crazy. I think a lot of that was done honestly because at a certain point, even for me, having observed how these protests built up, more and more people were coming, and it's sad to think that the government and the police did that to instill even more fear in people. Like they deliberately did that. They deliberately shot people, not because they were doing something wrong. They used those weapons. They used those tactics to put fear into people so that more people don't come out to express support for the people that were out there already protesting. It was really just something that you wouldn't see in a Western liberal democracy. So quite disgraceful, in my opinion.
And is it at those protests that you encountered and met Avi Yemeni?
That's right. Yeah. No, very early on, I would see, I'd known Avi's work from obviously online, and I would see him here and there at these protests, but we didn't have too much interaction early on in the protests because everything was just happening so rapidly. But the more and more you started going to these protests, what happened at a certain point in Melbourne was, as the police measures became more hardcore, there were fewer and fewer people going out at a certain point. So it was a small group of independent journalists, particularly like myself and Avi Yemeni from Rebel News, who were there at these protests. So we would inadvertently, of course, be in each other's, working together in some instances, almost as a shield, because you had to protect yourself in terms of if police would come arrest you or, they'd strike you with something, who knows? So we're kind of filming each other. It was almost like for safety in numbers in terms of working together in that independent media press pack. Because the mainstream journalists, they were nowhere to be seen at many of these protests. So there was a bit of that camaraderie there that I built up over that time with Avi, definitely.
I was watching those live streams and was shocked to see that the mainstream media appeared to be behind the police lines rather than in front of them. And it was people like Avi and yourself and a few others that were actually on the other side of the police lines with the protesters, recording the excesses and actually getting in harm's way yourself. And I can remember, I think it was you sticking a camera in one mainstream journalist's face, and he was like telling you off for doing your job. I just couldn't believe that.
Yeah, I mean, there was a lot of that going on. The media were pretty much there just liaising with the police, getting the police's perspective on everything, which is fine. Like, that's a part of the story as well. The police wouldn't necessarily liaise with us, but we were there getting the people's story. And I thought in that instance, in that moment, the people's story is probably what's more important and more interesting, even for people watching home on the news. There's no point as a journalist going out there and just verbatim, just repeating what the police tell you, right? You might as well just go out there and talk to the people on the street and ask why they're there. Not just make assumptions, because what the media were doing was standing behind police lines saying, hey, look, those people are out here. They shouldn't be out there. The police are saying they're bad people. And then they would go out in the night news and report that almost per word as what the police would tell them. Whereas if you spoke to the people, these weren't bad people. These were people who are out of work. These are people who are frustrated because, they have loved ones stuck overseas. These are people who didn't want to be forced into, these vaccine mandates, whatever it was. These are just ordinary people in the city of Melbourne who were having these issues with the government and how everything was going. And the fact that the media were not interested in their stories during that time shows you it's just a very sad indictment, really, of the mainstream media today and how easy it is for them just to hide behind police and pretend they're doing their job.
And the mainstream media still don't acknowledge the wrong that they were doing. Instead of holding the powerful to account, they were acting in many cases as snitches for the state, for the police. I can remember one protest which was led by the CFMEU. These are Labor constituents. These are hardcore workers, and they were protesting quite vociferously. And then the police moved in and started walloping these hardcore union guys, and it turned into a bit of biffo. And I don't think the police, really understood what they were doing or why they were doing it. They were just ordered to do it. And it's like we learned nothing from history.
Yeah, I mean, there was a lot of that. Some interactions that I had with the police and just observing the police talking with protesters, you could see that, there was one classic example here in Melbourne where a policeman was telling a protester, we don't want to be out here, but we're here because this is our job and we've got to look after our families. And the protester was telling the cop, well, I'm out here because I don't have a job and I want to look after my family. So it was almost like the police had been turned against the people and, they were doing their job. That's the excuse they gave. But that kind of justified it for them, which is in reality, like you said, going back to history, those things shouldn't justify people and police acting in that manner towards the public. But you saw the government there, classic example of them turning people against people, the police against people. Everyone's the same in that instance. But you had people with jobs like the police allowed to be out there to enforce these crazy draconian measures that sometimes even today, I can't imagine that we actually had those things when we walk around so freely in our cities and towns without these issues. But it happened. And I can't, it's still something I'm grappling with, but it's actually, something that concerns me because it shows me that it's possible again in an instance for that switch to be turned on. Because I don't think those lessons have been learned. They haven't been explored. And even our top brass, our commissioners of police, none of these people have actually ever come out, apologized for that time, or shown any type of remorse for the actions that their officers took. But speaking to individual members of the police force, a lot of them are remorseful for the things that they did and they were made to do. But again, they did those things regardless.
Yeah, I mean, you're a dinky-die Aussie, really. Reading, a bit of your history, I've had a look at a bit of a hit job on The Age where they where they try and describe yourself as a far right activist. But your family's from Sri Lanka. That's correct, isn't it?
Yeah, my family's migrated to Australia from Sri Lanka, and
yeah. So you understand probably better than most people what sectarian violence looks like, and how you can get there, and it never ends well.
Yeah, no, definitely. Like, even when I travel to Sri Lanka now, I'm very proud of that country. I love that country. But when I'm there, I know the police is corrupt. I know the government is corrupt. And I know the people who are the ordinary people have a rough go of it. And in Australia, I never, ever felt like that. But, until very recently, of course, when all these things went down, then I understood what people in countries like Sri Lanka and so on go up against. And I understood what their lives are actually like in that small snapshot that we experienced here in the West. So that gave me really great perspective on what it's like in, growing up in a country like that, because I've always been privileged to grow up in a country like Australia or, in New Zealand, whatever it is. It's amazing. We have all these, freedoms that we cherish, but we can't take it for granted, because once you lose that, there is something that can't be recreated. And in countries like Sri Lanka, those things have been lost a long time ago, and it's very hard for the people to regain those things. So for me today, as someone who has that perspective, and also being an Australian and, understanding the privileges that I have in that country, it gives me a different worldview, and it makes me even more staunch in my defense of those rights and liberties, because I see it as so valuable that I don't want to take it for granted. So I feel like there is a segment in our countries in the West here who take these things for granted, and they believe that these things have always just existed, and they don't understand that, a long time ago, certain people fought for these type of rights, and they sacrificed a lot. And they didn't do all of that so we could just turn our backs and walk away from it when the government, wanted to abuse those rights. We have a duty as a population, as a collective, to preserve those rights. And it's in these moments like, what happened during the pandemic, where those rights are tested, is when we have to stand up and be counted. And I really felt during that time that I was doing, something in that fashion.
I mean, it's a valuable lesson, but sadly we saw during the pandemic that the vast majority of the populations of New Zealand and Australia went along to get along, and there were very few people who actually stood up and said, no, actually, you know what, guys, these are human rights. These are our inalienable rights that you're trampling on for what is essentially a bad cold. And But it scares me. It still scares me today at how easy it was for our governments to move to totalitarianism. And I thought, studying history, that this sort of thing would never happen in our countries, and yet it did. And it happened in Victoria in the most appalling, brutal way. It happened in New Zealand in the most appalling, brutal way as well. And it just shocks me to my core that we've got these people walking around saying that was the right thing to do.
Yeah. I mean, you would think that after seeing everything, people would have a bit more of an understanding of what actually happened during that time. I think we have comforts here in these countries in the West where, things are almost taken care of. So we had a lot of, these government programs during that time to offer support for people, even though they didn't have work and all this kind of stuff. And then you had this whole kind of, this bureaucratic laptop class of people who were working from home and didn't really resonate with the working class who were put out of work. And these comforts that people are given, as particularly like the whole welfare state thing, where we're like, government's like, oh, we'll give you money to stay home. If you test positive, we'll give you money. I'm not sure exactly what they did in New Zealand.
Yeah, that's exactly what they did here.
That's what they're doing in Australia. So these comforts make us feel like we are much more of a elevated status as a society, where we can forego rights because we're giving people money and benefits for taking away those rights. I'm just giving a very simplistic explanation. So for that reason, I think people are more open to being abused by these governments, and the governments know this, and then they take advantage of this. And that's what you saw. And then when you tie that up with the influence of mainstream media and these institutions working in concert to actually fool people and not give them proper information about what's actually happening out there in the community, then they have the perfect recipe for this kind of totalitarian switch that they just turn on at the drop of a hat. Now, it didn't happen overnight, but it happened to progressed over a couple of weeks or months here in Melbourne where this change happened. But, it's too late. By the time before you even know it, you're stuck at home. You can't walk out of, your house without a 5 kilometer radius of your house. You can't walk out. Kids can't go to the playground anymore because obviously that's off limits now. You can't exercise by yourself outside without wearing a mask. It's like all these things are drip fed, but once it happens, it's happened. And, I think we don't challenge it early on enough. And by the time that we do challenge it as a collective, the powers that be with the media and so on, control that narrative and paint the people that challenge these things as, extremists, anti-vaxxers, far right, whatever they want to term it as. And they try to control that narrative. And I think, that switch that happened during COVID where people did stand up, that is why now you're seeing governments in Australia and so on work on these type of disinformation, misinformation bills where they want to take even more control of the media and target, people like myself, independent media, Avi Yemeni and so on, to control the flow of information, because they do see that over time, if people are exposed to the ideas of other people who are telling them a different perspective or giving them an alternative angle, then their control is not as much as they thought it would be. So there is something there, but overall, if things stay how they are, the government definitely can turn on that totalitarian switch at the drop of a hat if they wanted to.
Well, they've proved it, haven't they? They know how to do it, and they know how to manipulate the vast majority of people to do what they want. And
that's right.
One thing I know about politicians, being with 40 years of commenting on them and being involved in politics, is they love power like a heroin addict loves needles. And they just like using it whenever they can. And if you don't stop and say to them enough, you can't do that, and you don't stand up, then you've lost a little bit, and by a little bit, and a little bit, and a little bit, a little bit, it's all gone, and then you're under total state control. And I cannot believe that these places in the West just fell for all of this nonsense. And you see people like the World Economic Forum, and you've been to Davos, you've confronted these elites on the street. What do they have to say when you ask them questions?
I think they're a bit offended that you're actually even there asking these type of questions, because they're just always used to controlling the environment, right? It's their own little world. It's their little bubble. Everyone else is a serf outside their kingdom type system. That's what they've got set up there. So even something like Davos, I mean, that's so hard to get to for the average person. That's like a very remote style thing that they do where they're flying with their private jets and have this little get together. It's meant to be exclusive for them and not inclusive of everyone else. And these are, of course, people that go on about inclusion and diversity and so on. But when it comes to controlling power, they're not very diverse or inclusive of other people, right? So, I mean, these people, haven't got much to say about them, which is nice. I understand why there is institutions like this and why, certain governments and stuff might want to work with these institutions. But I think the secrecy that they do these things in, and the fact that the government involvement itself isn't so, at least as what my understanding for the Australian politicians, isn't so transparent, the type of influence that they're having on policy. I think that's something that needs to be checked into a lot more by the mainstream journalists, which don't seem to do this at all. The job does fall onto journalists like Avi Yemeni, who were out there. I think he was questioning Albert Bourla last year, the CEO of Pfizer. I mean, that guy looked like he's never received questions like that in his life. And he does media interviews. He goes on mainstream channels, but you can tell it's all very scripted. There's a set of things that they touch on, and it's, they're just rubbing each other's backs. But once you actually confront these people on the street, all of a sudden they're running scared. They don't want to answer just very basic, legitimate questions that the public would have. And these are people who are, these companies like Pfizer, who are signing these massive contracts with our governments, telling people to get their products, but they won't be transparent with the members of the public themselves. The CEOs are hidden behind these, impenetrable almost, fences that are there that you can't question them on certain topics. So I think it's great that independent journalists are there more and more now at events like Davos and are digging into these things, because it's making them uncomfortable. And I think when they're uncomfortable, that's better than them just hiding up there, being comfortable and dictating what's going to happen next for our lives out here in the everyday normal world that we all live in.
Yeah, there's a few detractors out there about what you do, what I do, what Avi Yemeni does, what Ezra Levant does. And they put out, videos saying that Rebel News is controlled opposition, that Rukshan Fernando is controlled opposition. You would never be able to film where you did at Davos unless somebody was giving you permission to do that. What do you say to those people who make those accusations?
Look, I think it's all a bunch of nonsense. Like, especially when I hear that now, like I hear the craziest conspiracies about myself, and it gives me a lot of perspective on when I hear things about other people as well that people are saying. I don't believe many things I hear about people in that sense. Things like Davos or any kind of thing, particularly things in the West, what people have to understand is it's not as closed off as it appears to be. The reason that something like Davos is not attended by a lot of people is it's very hard to access because of where it is.
Yeah.
You have to make the effort to get to Switzerland. You have to make the effort then to get accommodation near there. Then you have to drive to that area, and then you try to do what you can as a journalist. So those limitations is what makes it inaccessible for people in the West in these type of things. Now, if we were, for instance, being flown into North Korea and covering Kim Jong-un or something like that, and it appeared that we were giving access to all these places, then yes, maybe you could make an argument that there's something strange going on in there. But if you're attending something as a journalist in the West, where it's easily accessible, you can just fly into the country, then you're just doing the basic act of doing journalism. And the reason that mainstream media gets to go there is because they're well funded. Now, luckily, outfits like Rebel News, because of them, I was able to go there because they were able to fund the journey of independent journalists thanks to their subscriber base and people who support them. Yeah. So it's through that type of venture that independent media like myself and Avi Yemeni are able to be there and cover these type of stories. So I think there's a disconnect because people need to understand that you need to have traditional independent style journalists at these events. And just because they go there does not mean they're controlled opposition. A lot of the time, they're just providing an alternative opinion. And it's just to challenge the mainstream narrative. It's not necessarily to say that the opinions or the stories that we're doing are the exact correct opinion or version of the event. It's an alternative viewpoint from what we observed and from the questions we are asked. And it's all out there for people to see. And it's just so people can make their own judgment many of the times. And I think it's a great disservice that, that the media and everyone else is doing to independent media by calling these type of journalists controlled opposition, or, one of the classic words they use is grifters.
Yeah.
Because people, like Avi Yemeni and Rebel News and stuff, they depend on the user base supporting them. And that's totally fine, right? That's how it should be. People send all sorts of money to people sitting at home playing video games on their computer, adding no value at all to society. But here we have people supporting journalists to go out there and do fundamental journalistic style work. And that is just a style of fundraising that sometimes we have to do in today's world. And I think I'm totally comfortable with that. And I don't care too much for what people are saying about this, because I think it's very important work that needs to be done.
What you seem to be talking about there is this polarization that's occurred in society, where you're either with the prevailing narrative or against it. And this politics comes into even journalism. And I suspect that you and I have a very different worldview on our politics. I'm a conservative person who's always supported, until recently, conservative politicians and conservative political parties. You've been a Labour voter in Victoria and in Australia, but the pandemic kind of threw people like you and I together, where we might not share the same worldview on politics, but we share the same view on important freedoms. And it's kind of, in my mind, it seems to have broken the right versus left narrative. And we're now in a position where people like ourselves are documenting the fight between those who support freedom and those who wish to restrict freedom.
Yeah, it's become very polarizing. Just to kind of give a bit more background on that. So my parents have always been Labour voters, and I kind of grew up in that environment. But I've always been a bit more in terms of the Liberal Party here, so a bit more leaning towards conservatism. And today I'm more openly that. But in terms of the divide and how polarizing it is, there is literally people now like who would traditionally have fought against, something like this misinformation, censorship style bills that they're introducing into our countries. They would have fought against these things on principle, but because they believe that it will somehow defeat the rise of the right or the far right, however they want to term it. And these are the people that we want to stop them from having influence online. So because it will defeat them, we are happy to forego our principles and support the government in censoring everyone just to defeat them. And that's how kind of the world has become now, where it's no longer about people on their principles and doing things which are right by society as a whole. It's more so about, ideologically, how will this benefit, at the current point, my political ideological leanings. And I think that's a dangerous place to be. And I think governments, they take advantage of this type of thing. They understand what this is. You see this in America all the time. You see all their 3-letter agencies, they take advantage of this. The media takes advantage of this. And at the end of the day, whether you're left or right, whatever political spectrum you're on, you get screwed over by this. Because more and more what's happening is the government is just solidifying their own power through legislation, and it's to everyone else's detriment. So I think we should unite on a lot of different topics. And I think it's great that we do have, these fierce debates and that we don't agree on everything. Usually the benefit of our systems of government is the fact that we land somewhere in the middle on most issues. It's not about going one way or the other. It might go one way for a while and it might then, switch over as society changes. That is a wonderful thing, but you can't have that without having these fierce debates and discussions. And the fact that that's people trying to just silence that from happening at all, I think is very dangerous territory, because the people that come into that space are, of course, again, governments, institutions, World Economic Forums, the UN, all these kind of institutions, which have a different style of, controlling these type of activities, and they will do it. And, all we have as people is the fact that we can argue and debate with each other and come to a satisfactory type of result, so-called democracy. I think we need to preserve that as much as we can.
Yeah, I agree with you there. We need to have more courageous discourse where we disagree with each other, but can, through that discourse, through that communication, come to an agreement on what should be protected and what should be fought for. And censorship is something that I find appalling, because censorship leads to totalitarianism. When freedom dies in silence, when you are shut down and you can't talk and you can't debate these issues. If you're shut down, then your freedom is slowly dying in silence, because you're not allowed to speak. And I think we need to, almost wreck the political system in some way, not talking about violently, of course, but it needs to be some sort of change. It happens in society where opinions are valued again, rather than devalued or ridiculed or marginalized. Because marginalization, again, leads to segregation, which leads to polarization, which leads to ultimately violence, which we've seen all around the world, places like Sri Lanka, Rwanda, the Congo, various different places where there's these conflicts because of excesses of one particular, persuasion of view. I still find it astonishing that we ended up where we did, in the pandemic, in Australia, in New Zealand, can-do countries that descended into totalitarianism in a heartbeat. And I think those courageous discourses need to occur more often, more frequently. And that's why I look at what you do and what Avi does and what Ezra is trying to do. And I just value those people and, follow them and support where I can and do all of those things, because I think that we're all doing valuable work. There's not enough of us. That's the problem. We need to get that message out. And I guess that's why you're here in New Zealand, with Avi's book launch on Friday and Saturday in Auckland and Wellington.
Yeah, that's why I'm here. I'm here to support Avi Yemeni, of course.
Yeah.
I'm here to support journalists like this. And I'm here to support just more people, like you said, getting on board and doing things like this. We are so fortunate and we are so lucky to have the technological advancements where we're able to do this type of work. And we should take advantage of that. There is a massive fight on our hands in terms of who controls this type of power. And I'm saying around issues like censorship, I think that is the next frontier. That is where a lot of this battle will be fought, because, I'm not sure if you guys have a disinformation bill here in New Zealand.
Yeah, we do.
So I see that what's happening in Australia as one of the biggest threats to everything, because the moment they can control speech, the moment the government can decide what is right and wrong, there is no future protest. There is no future dissent on anything. Like, that is the ultimate form of control. And people might laugh at us when, we bring up 1984, this novel, and George Orwell and all this kind of stuff. And people are like, conspiracy theorists and stuff. Actually, that's what's happening. And it's happening very in our face. It's happening in our face. And if we don't fight back against this and have just enough control there as the public to have independent media, to have alternative media, to challenge mainstream media, to challenge government, to do these things, then we're losing in today's world, because information is everything. And this war on information that's been waged by governments and institutions is a war that people have to stand up to, because we are the biggest losers if we don't maintain some of that control in our hands as well. So this technology that we have to ensure that the government doesn't have their overreaching arms in it. Now, I know big tech, they have their own types of censorship, but that is very different to when the government has that control. So that's what people need to understand. Just because Facebook or Twitter or X, whatever, might censor you, is not the same thing as when the government, with the power of the state and the power of the courts and the power of law enforcement, has that same power. So I think that's the biggest fight on our hands, and that's why I'm here supporting Avi Yemeni and others like him and you guys and everyone like this, because I feel like we're at a crossroads in this mission to ensure that our voices continue to be heard in this space.
That's the thing, isn't it? Because the mainstream media let society down quite badly. And they seem to not want to either be forgiven or to even say sorry for what they did. And, if you actually confront them and talk to them, they say, I'm proud of what we did. And what they did is became the mouthpieces of the government, propagandists. Corporate shills, they call us grifters, but they were all in receipt of large amounts, millions and millions of dollars of government funding, government advertising, and they have the cheek to criticize us who are, using technology, our laptops, our microphones, our portable equipment to do what these multi-million-dollar corporations that are part of the system that actually have become the elites themselves.
That's right.
And they really don't like it when we get up them. And
no, I'll tell you what, we in the West, we look at countries, let's say something's happening in Iran, there's a protest happening in Iran, and you see this footage coming from a mobile phone from an independent journalist. you have these Western journalists. They're like, "Oh, this is amazing. Look at this journalist putting himself out there." Because the state media, they're getting funding from the Iranian regime, and they're not going to say anything bad about Iran. But it's these people on the ground that are getting this information out to us. How wonderful. You have the Facebook and Twitter saying, "Oh, we're going to ensure that those services remain available despite the government trying to shut it down." So we act all high and mighty and moral when it comes to these kind of instances. But what is so sad is our own governments and these companies and the mainstream media actually turn against their own people when push comes to shove. And that is what happened during that time. We were watching stuff from people's mobile phones when this, heavily funded media, I think in New Zealand, they received massive grants from the government to do what? To cover the stories or to just spill out government propaganda? We know what happened, but, they use that money for, I'm just alleging here, to spread government propaganda as far as I'm concerned.
There's no alleging. That's exactly what they did.
That's what they did, right? But, why not use that funding to actually go out there and speak to people that have a different viewpoint, to speak to doctors or scientists that have a different viewpoint? What was there something stopping them from doing that? Like, you know what I mean? Like, this is the choices that these people made. And they're choices that, like you said, they're elites. They're looking down on the rest of us. They know what's best. The government tells them what's best. The institutions tell them what's best, and they're happy with that. These journalists, these mainstream organizations, they're no longer this fourth estate. They're a part of. They're an arm of the government, and we confront state media in these dictatorial style countries, but really we have a form of state controlled media in the West, and we have to come to terms with that. We have to really come to terms with that. And I think we have to educate the rest of the public on that as well, that actually, even though these corporations, they might seem separate from the state, they are so intertwined with them. It's not funny. So that is why it's so important. Again, independent media, alternative media, crowdsourced media funded by the people, for the people, having that alternative perspective. I'm not saying it's always the be and end all of what is the correct information or whatever. Those are things that can be disputed and challenged by everyone else around you. But having that alternative perspective adds a lot of value to society, and we need to ensure that people recognize this.
Yeah, I can see that you are very passionate about this. In fact, you're not doing wedding videos anymore, are you? You're just concentrating on the journalism.
Yeah, look, I mean, the wife is taking care of the business. Yeah. And I do participate in, working on the weekends at weddings here and there. But I am focusing on this type of work because, Australia, New Zealand, we're interesting countries in the sense that we are smaller in population and size compared to somewhere like the US and the UK, where there is a lot of alternative media and alternative voices with a lot of support. To grow that in our countries it's a lot harder, I think, and to break those barriers and give people an alternative is a lot harder. I just see myself as not doing anything noble, but just doing my part, trying my best to have alternative things out there in terms of alternative voices. Really, it's not always about I can't as an individual cover every single story that's happening, but I will pick a subject where I feel the media is not giving it a fair go. Yeah. And then I'll attempt to show people, hey, this is what these other people who are in this story are saying. Look at both things and make up your mind about what you think is right, or ask more questions. And, that's my approach to all of this.
Yeah, it's an approach that Reality Check Radio has as well, where we, are giving both sides or all sides of an argument, an issue, a debate, and let listeners decide for themselves based on the information that's imparted. But you can't impart that information, in the traditional corporate mainstream media where everything is chunked down into 5-minute bits. There's a reason why we do 45-minute interviews, hour-long interviews, even 2-hour-long interviews, because that time allows us to explore the breadth of issues that we've discussed today, that have gone from workers in the street that haven't got any money through to geopolitical issues like Sri Lanka and around the world. You can't do that in 5-minute bullet point attack pieces that the mainstream media likes to feed us on the news. And it's just insane. But, I can see that you are enjoying your new life as an independent journalist just as much as I'm enjoying being an independent radio host, And I think if people like you and me and Avi and Ezra carry on being resolutely positive and infectious about the ideas that we want to share, which is about freedom, then more and more people are going to like what they're hearing. They're going to subscribe to our podcasts, to our our X channels, our YouTube channels, all of those sorts of things, and we will grow, and the mainstream media will wither. But we have to be resolute in doing that. And I just want to thank you for what you did, during the pandemic, that you stood up and used your considerable skills to tell a story. And, that's what the traditional journalists did. They tell a story. Here's a story. And don't insert yourself into it other than to say, this is what I'm seeing, or this is what I'm hearing. And I think it's refreshing. And I respect what you guys are doing. And that's why I'm supporting the book launch as well. And I've just found out today that I'm the MC for both events.
That's awesome.
So I've been roped into that. But I look forward to seeing you on Friday. And thank you so much for coming on The Crunch and being with us here in New Zealand.
Thanks, mate. Lovely to be here. Thanks for having me on your show.
No problem. Thank you, Rukshan. How about those amazing insights into the media landscape? Very wise words there from Rukshan, and it shows he's a true professional who cares deeply about the important role we have in the media. Don't forget to send comments on Rukshan's interview to inbox@realitycheck.radio or text to 2057.
Our text machine is now live. Send us your thoughts by texting your message to 2057. That's 2057. So get in touch with us now.
The greatest threat to our democracy and our country is the belief that someone else will save it. RCR is on a mission to revive honest media, and now you too can help make that happen. Introducing the Foundation Members Club, the easiest way to support RCR and be rewarded for doing so. Receive exclusive benefits only for members, including your very own backstage pass to join the hosts for interactive behind-the-scenes discussions. And also our all-new daily curated news summary, RCR Bites, delivered to your email inbox every morning, keeping you on the pulse of the news that matters in just a few minutes per day. To find out more, visit realitycheck.radio/members and see how you too can join the mission that's making a difference.
This is The Crunch with Cam Slater. Conversations with a side of controversy, right here on RCR.
Avi Yemini needs no introduction. His reputation as a fierce journalist challenging the narrative is second to none. He's here in New Zealand to launch his book From the Cancel Capital of the World. I'm very privileged to be his MC for his book launch in Auckland and Wellington, and he's with me now for a quick update about that. You've managed to get yourself through customs and immigration this time, Avi. Welcome to The Crunch.
Hey, mate. Well, I did promise you guys that I was going to come no matter what they said, and here I am. I don't have much in life, but my word is everything.
Yeah. So you have bucked immigration, you've bucked the police, you've fought them, you went to court, I think. You've provided a whole lot of information to them. You've got a visa. You're here now, and you're here for your book launch on Friday in Auckland and Saturday in Wellington.
Absolutely. And look, we didn't even end up having to go to court because thanks to your help and we managed to get all those documents, which as soon as I saw the internal communications, I knew there was no way they were willing to go to court. There was a big part of me that wanted to be rejected because I really did want to have Jacinda Ardern there on the stand, who opened herself up to the whole situation when she denied any interference and her government's interference. It would have been so good. How good would that have been? Me versus Jacinda. I would have been self-representing just for the bands. But here I am, and I'm so excited to see everyone in Auckland and Wellington.
There's still tickets available. How can they get tickets, Avi?
Rebelfromthestart.com. Firstly, if you don't have the book, in fact, you can get the book there on the day, but if you don't have the book and you're not coming to the event, what are you doing? Rebelfromthestart.com. Get the book and give us a real review. So if you hate it, let us know. One thing you'll notice is no one that's actually reviewed that's given us a bad one has actually read it. So if anything, you just want to hear a good story, whether you love or hate me, I think it's a pretty decent story, rebelfromthestart.com. And you can also book in for the events on that page. Scroll down a little bit. Want to see you all there.
Just want to explore a couple of little topics before you get away with your busy schedule that you've got, Avi. There's a few people out there that don't like you. You had a bit of a war with a mainstream radio host. You posted that video. That was an interesting exchange that you had.
Which one are we talking about?
Oh, the recent one. The recent one that you know he'd finally read your book and then decided to get you on his show.
Yeah, Neil Mitchell. Look, I thought it was a decent interview. I've got to give him credit where credit is due. He's willing to sit down and have the conversation, and I thought it was pretty respectful. I know people watched different parts of it and took different things away, got upset with him. I'm not upset with him. For him to come out and actually sit down and have that conversation, all props to him.
I got to say, your book is a riveting read. But you have got detractors out there, and there's a couple of people out there that call you controlled opposition. Are you controlled opposition, Avi? You know, you get in behind the scenes in Davos.
They're getting confused with their conspiracy theories. I'm the Jew, so I'm the controller. Rukshan is the control opposition. I am Rukshan's puppet master no matter what he says.
Right. Because it's a Jewish conspiracy that controls the media, right?
Yeah. It's all a conspiracy, and I'm there at the top.
One thing that I always say to my Jewish friends is, if there's this conspiracy that you all control the media, how come you get such bad press?
I know we get such bad press. It's like on every level. You know what? I think I was thinking about it today. The biggest minority in the world, the most persecuted minority in the world would be conservative Jews, because everyone hates us, even those establishment Jews that the conspiracy theorists blame for everything. And like they're the kind of Jews I don't like, and they certainly don't like me either. But conservative Jews, they cop it from all angles, the far left, the far right, the Islamists. And then within the Jewish community, those same Jews that give us a bad rap, a bad name.
Yeah, I'm confused by all of these conspiracy theories. It just goes round and round and round and round in circles. Aren't you just speaking truth to power like journalists are supposed to do?
I'm trying to. And there's, no one tells me what to think or say. Oh, well, a lot of people try telling me what to think and what I'm allowed to think, like the rest of the public. But I have my own brain, and I think I approach things from a common sense perspective. And if I get it wrong, which I have, I'm happy to be the first to pull myself up on it and apologize for getting it wrong or recognizing that I get it wrong. But I think I mostly get it right, hey?
Well, I think we need to change our pronouns to "I told you so."
Exactly.
And we're seeing that happen increasingly as people are getting sick and unfortunately people dying. And it looks like we were right all along, but they still don't want to admit to that.
No, that's the difference between us and them. Well, that's one of the differences. The other difference is when you talk about controlled opposition, I think that those that are controlled are really, you just got to, that old, follow the money. You can follow the money in my case. There ain't much of it. But in their cases, there's often a really big, at best, conflict of interest, at worst, controlled narrative, which is, in a lot of cases, I think is true. Bought and paid for. The media, come on, New Zealand, bought and paid for. New Zealand is the most bought and paid for place on the planet. The media itself cannot even pretend to be, fair, balanced, and uncontrolled. The bloody government owns at least what they publish because through all the funding that they give them. So I don't, somebody asked me today, how dare you call New Zealand North Korea? I go, you know what? I actually have more respect. And when I say New Zealand, I'm not talking about the people of New Zealand. I'm talking about the government. I have more respect for the North Korean government than I do the New Zealand government, because at least the North Korean government are honest about what they are. The New Zealand government pretends like they're a Western democratic country. Remember, I was banned from coming for my propensity to incite people with other views.
I know.
Don't forget that.
Yeah, that's exactly what they said in the
black and white. Their words, not mine. Their words, not mine. And I love how the media tries to, oh no, you just filled in paperwork wrong. Dude, there is no paperwork when you come from Australia to New Zealand. There was suddenly paperwork for me that I filled in wrong. Never show me the wrong paperwork I filled in. Show me it.
Yeah.
Because what I can show you, you can't show me it because there was no paperwork. What I can show you is in black and white communications between the government, different government agencies, trying to stop me from getting there before they even knew I was coming there, based on a New Zealand Herald article saying that they had to stop me because I have a propensity to incite people with opposing views. If you're okay with that, probably don't come to the events over the weekend. Actually, I don't mind if you come. We can have a bit of a chat.
Yeah.
I'll bring my camera and let's talk about it. I am known for having a propensity to incite people with opposing views, so maybe you should come.
So am I, Avi. So am I. The whole thing about this, though, Avi, is astonishing because there were the police in black and white saying, we really don't want this guy to come here. Please give us an excuse to stop him.
Yeah.
In black and white. Now,
in black and white.
Who are the people who told the police to do that?
Well, I think it was the New Zealand Herald, because if you follow the timeline, there was firstly that article, and then through that article, they requested comment from the government, which requesting comment in the way that they did it is basically more like instructing the government, hold on, are you led? In fact, if you look at the publication, the original publication, they were explaining why they can ban me, all the reasons, the powers the government has to ban me.
Yeah.
That's not a question. That's an order. And, I think that incestuous relationship between the government and the media in New Zealand, it goes both ways. The government pays the media through all these financial incentives. They pay the media and say, hey, but you have to give us a good rap. You have to make sure to support all our crazy policies, especially through COVID. We saw that. And then the media turns around and says, oh, hold on. There's somebody that's stolen all the eyeballs and woken up too many people in Australia who's coming in. You need to stop this guy. And look at all these powers you have. Why are you not stopping him? And boom, they stop him. And then when it comes out that it wasn't actually the reason the government gave in the beginning, the media runs cover for him and says, no, it's all nothing to see here. Nothing. In fact, they were super quiet after that all came out. But here I am, and Cam, as a token of my appreciation for everything you did through that period, you're going to be, I don't know if it's a token of appreciation or a punishment, but You're going to be, am I allowed to say that you're going to be emceeing the two events? Hopefully they run smoothly, but
But we're controlled opposition, so we'll control the narrative.
Either way, it'll be a night with a propensity to incite people with opposing views. I freaking love that tagline. I think I might steal the government's tagline.
It's like one of my mates who's one of the top bloggers in New Zealand. He had a former Prime Minister's husband write a letter to the editor about him, saying that it just seems that he likes to foment happy mischief.
I love it.
Yeah.
Hey, Cam, I've probably got to back out in a minute.
Yeah, just one thing before you go, Avi, because I know you're busy, trying to foment happy mischief in New Zealand.
I can't talk to you because I can't incite you. You don't have opposing views. Go on.
No, I think we have opposing views. Look, there's one, you're talking about the government in New Zealand funding media, and there's he's a lawyer. He uses a pseudonym because, it's like in New Zealand.
He's brave. Yep.
He's brave. But he's been outlining in the last couple of days and just dropped a whole lot more, yesterday, where he has, under the Official Information Act, gathered documents that show that the government approached Television New Zealand, which is the state television broadcaster, owned 100% by the government, about a special relationship, and they actually used that word, relating to climate change back in 2022, and they signed the documents on the 31st of October in order to coincide with COP27, where they have orchestrated government ministers and various other people like Greenpeace, etc., to create a narrative around COP27 where there's interviews by John Campbell and other TV hosts in New Zealand that are very well known, and it all appears it's completely orchestrated, paid for, or sponsored content that was never told to viewers, that was never declared. What does that make TVNZ, and what does that make the government?
Corrupt.
That's
it. That is it. That you cannot speak truth to power when you're running those kinds of when you're setting it up like that. You're not holding anyone accountable. You're not asking tough questions. You, as a media organization, by the definition of what you're supposed to be doing, you are corrupt. As a government, who's supposed to just put out the policies and allow free and open press, by controlling the media like that, that's corrupt. So there is no other way to describe that.
It gives you an example, right, of what they did. It's pure political propaganda. They wanted out of TVNZ a full 1 hour climate special screened in primetime television. This is the government telling the state-owned broadcaster what they wanted. Then online content hosted on their websites with a dedicated web page, digital banners, logo placement, and pre-roll commercials playing before the video content.
That is so mad.
Right?
That is insane. I'm even shocked for New Zealand.
It gets worse. Listen to this. They want 5 onenews.co.nz articles, stories on the One News website, 5 One News social media posts on Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, and they want breakfast show integration with 5 interviews across a week on breakfast television with a large range of climate energy experts, and then a 7 Sharp interview, which is an evening current affairs show, with a climate energy ambassador. And they're going to provide all the licensed footage and talent, the rights to use all of that for anything that was created outside TVNZ, and then do joint press releases and host a climate special for 12 months on the streaming app that TVNZ has. That's what they've asked for.
Yeah.
And they paid $200,000 for that.
Like I said to you, I called it corrupt before I knew all of that. Gosh, even I'm surprised. Even I'm shocked, and that's why it's so important for your listeners out there and anyone with half a brain to switch off the mainstream media and start listening to alternative voices. That doesn't necessarily mean you have to believe everything you hear from anyone, even if you like or dislike the person. You know what? Listen to all sides. and critically think and make up your own mind. But most importantly, this weekend, Auckland, Wellington, I can't wait to see you all there.
And I can't wait to see you there. And thanks for dropping me in it. As MC, I'll have to come up with some witty stories to tell. But everyone's
Absolutely.
more interested in your witty stories because it's your book that we're launching.
That's all right. There's room for the both of us.
Well, I am taller than you, so that's all right.
You and 99.9% of the population.
Thank you very much for coming on The Crunch, Avi. I will see you on Friday at the book launch, and I'm looking forward to both of us raising hell.
Thank you, brother.
Okay, thanks. Talking to Avi is always a case of trying to pin him down. He's like a jack-in-the-box and an Energizer bunny combined. You never know what he's going to say next. I hope you can join us tomorrow in Auckland and on Saturday in Wellington to help launch his book. And I hope you enjoyed hearing his pearls of wisdom as much as I enjoyed talking about them with him. Fill that mailbag with comments about Avi to inbox at realitycheck.radio or text to 2057.
What I want to achieve with RCR is conversation. And I think we have lost the art of conversation.
With RCR, I just hope that people can learn that we can all be different, we can have our own opinions, have our own views, and have those conversations in a respectful way, because respect needs to be given, it needs to be earned, and I think that we can prove that people of all diverse perspectives, ages, opinions can have a platform and we can work and talk together, and so that's what I hope we get to achieve with RCR.
Just independent thought, alternative thought, and I expect that I will be castigated by many people for offering different opinions. But, as I've said before, there is no such thing as a wrong opinion. Opinions are like noses. Everybody's got one.
The exchange of views, fair debate, no cancelling, no interrupting, no aggressive responses. We want to hear what people have to say, whatever side you're on. And the listener, the consumer, with that information, can make of it what they will. That is the mission. It's a good mission.
You're listening to The Crunch with Cam Slater, right here on RCR, Reality Check Radio.
Ezra Levant is a Canadian conservative media personality, political activist, writer, broadcaster, and a former lawyer. Ezra is the co-founder, owner, and CEO of what the elites call a far-right media website, Rebel News. He's affectionately known as the Rebel Commander, though I'm not sure how he'd look in an orange flight suit or maybe flying an X-Wing fighter. He's here in New Zealand to help launch Avi Yemini's new book before jetting out to Melbourne. It's his first time in New Zealand, so here's a warm welcome to New Zealand from Reality Check Radio. Welcome to New Zealand, Ezra.
Cam, it's great to be here.
Is this your first time in New Zealand, Ezra?
It is, and I'm looking forward to it. I've visited Australia before, but of course, New Zealand is an entirely different world, and I'm delighted to be in Auckland today. We're going to Wellington later. Hopefully, I'll have a chance to tour around a little. So it's not a very long visit, but I'm already having a great time.
It's great to have you here, and it's I've been following yourself and Rebel News and the growth and also the trials and tribulations that you've been through in Canada and also Australia with Avi for quite some time. So it's going to be a real pleasure to finally meet you in person and at Avi's book launch on Friday night.
Well, thanks very much for your kind words, and the feeling's mutual. I know it's tough to be a citizen journalist like you are when you're competing against not just the corporate media, but increasingly the government media, not just government funded, but in many ways government directed. And to be a nonconformist, to be contrarian, to be skeptical, those used to be traits of all journalists, but it's sort of being drummed out of the profession. So I salute you. You're one of the few lonely voices in this country fighting back against what I call the regime media.
Regime media, that's appropriate because I I labelled the Ardern government as a regime because of the excesses under COVID of what they had, very similar to what you had in Canada and almost identical to what Dan Andrews did to Victoria, that Avi and Rukshan had to deal with. And they really were regimes. So I think it's the only way that we can describe it. And this global creep of controlling information. You know, the internet was supposed to give us freedom of information, and now they're seeking to control it.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you mentioned Avi and Rukshan. They really were lonely voices in one of the worst lockdown cities in the world, Melbourne, Australia. And as you know, Avi was literally arrested, stomped to the ground, thrown in the back of a police truck, driven far away. I think it might have been even 5 times altogether. And eventually they apologized to him, but not until after we took them to court, which most people don't have the financial ability or even the know-how. How do you sue the government? It's an impossible thing. And so Avi fought back. But for every guy who fought back, there's got to be 10 or 100 who couldn't fight back, didn't fight back. And the whole reason they go after guys like Avi is to make people think, wow, if they can do that to Avi, they can for sure do that to me. So it's sort of a demoralization tactic to really make an example out of nonconformists. So I mean, you don't want to be contrarian just for being contrarian's sake. Although, frankly, I like people like that because they force you to check your biases. But these days, there's such a conformity. I use the phrase regime media. Some people say legacy media. I don't even know if I'd say mainstream media anymore. But they're really trying to censor citizen journalists because they really want to control the narrative. And you're right. The internet is the main way they're doing that. And they've totally colonized Facebook and YouTube and Google. And it's only since Elon Musk took over Twitter that we've realized the depth of the colonization by what's sometimes called the deep state, FBI, CIA. I presume Australia's government has a hand in things in Australia and New Zealand. What we know, Jacinda Ardern said during the early days of the pandemic, basically she said, trust us, trust everything we say. We'll be your source of all the news you want. And we know what's true. I know I'm paraphrasing there, but she really was shocking in terms of her hubris that only she knew the truth.
Yeah, we used to mock the podium which she stood behind and called it the podium of truth. But she actually said not to trust anybody else other than the government, and that we're your one source of truth. She actually said that.
Yeah. That's the exact wording. I've seen that clip so many times. And the shocking thing, Cam, is how many New Zealanders said, okay. I mean, and I'm not blaming New Zealand. Canadians, Americans, Europeans, they did the same thing. I mean, there's an instinct in all of us. I think it probably dates back to prehistoric times, probably even to caveman times. Stick with the herd and you'll be safe. You can see it in nature. Fish swim in a school. Buffalo run in a herd. It makes you safer from the wolves, from the sharks. And I think that in a time of crisis and danger and fear and risk, there is a human instinct to just obey authority, stick with the herd, do what everyone else is doing, and you'll be safe. And I think that really came out during the pandemic. And we saw people lusting for more government control. There were freedom fighters. I count you amongst them. But for every freedom fighter, I have to say there were more people who sort of liked the comfort of having an authoritarian regime. And I find it a little embarrassing. Canada went that way too. I mean, we in the province of Quebec, which is the French-speaking part of Canada, they had actual curfews from 10 p.m. to 5 a.m., whether you were vaccinated or not, whether you were sick or not. And some people loved it. And no court ever struck that down as unconstitutional. That's another thing, is that the checks and balances in our democracies, they failed. Think about the checks and balances that we count on. Opposition parties who didn't oppose.
No.
Courts that didn't strike these things down. The media were absolute propagandists. They weren't skeptical. Colleges of physicians and surgeons, like the regulators of doctors, any doctor who had a, quote, second opinion, that doctor was investigated.
Or cancelled. They were victimized just as much as the ordinary citizens were. In fact, more so probably.
Yeah, and it was to enforce a conformity, give the illusion that everyone was fine with this. Because look, there's not a single doctor who objects. Yeah, because you've suspended the ones who don't. And I don't know. I think it showed some real cracks in our intellectual, democratic, ability to think through crises. And some people, I see news in America that they're talking about bringing back masks again. In fact, we see the first institutions talking about masks just for 14 days. And I know that too many people will embrace that. I think more people will be skeptical this time, but there will be people who embrace it. And look, Dan Andrews was reelected, if I recall. And, I don't know enough about New Zealand politics to comment, but in many Canadian jurisdictions, the locker downers were reelected. Justin Trudeau, who many people have compared to Jacinda Ardern. Justin Trudeau was reelected. And in the Canadian provinces, the ones with one exception, the ones who were the locker downers were reelected. So they believe, not only were they right, but they believe that the people support them. And I have to say there's some truth there, is that maybe we're not as freedom loving as I really want to believe that human beings yearn for freedom. But I think what the pandemic showed us is that many of our friends and neighbors yearn for, quote, security.
They yearn for control. And, we saw this here in New Zealand. Jacinda Ardern, we've got an electoral system that was designed actually at the end of World War II to prevent majority parties taking complete control of the parliament in Germany. New Zealand adopted the MMP system. And, for 30 years, we didn't have one party getting a majority. So they had to form coalitions. People were sold on the story that they would then be collaborative and it would be all, motherhood and apple pie and the politicians would get on together. Well, Jacinda Ardern, the lockdown princess, managed to get the rare feat of an absolute majority under MMP. And then she really went to town. Which obviously culminated in the parliamentary protests, which echoed the truckers' convoy that you had in Canada. And but that actually in New Zealand was the beginning of the end of Ardern, because that protest of those courageous people who had lost jobs, had lost their houses, their friends, their families, their careers, had nothing left to lose, all turned up at Parliament and protested. And that's when Jacinda Ardern started to realise that not everyone was on board with her kindness, that she used to call it.
Yeah, and some of these leaders started to convince themselves that everyone agreed because, first of all, they weren't going out and about in regular gatherings. They weren't on the hustings. They weren't at town hall meetings because the gatherings were all shut down. So the only person, so in their defense, and I think that a lot of them knew exactly what they were doing, but in their defense, if I had to explain things from their side, I would say they were in these cocoons where everyone agreed. And perhaps you're right. Perhaps seeing those protesters shocked her and said, oh, maybe not everyone agrees. And in Canada, where the trucker convoy was, I estimate that there were tens of thousands of truckers, maybe 100,000 other people who protested in solidarity. But I believe that fully 1 million people observed firsthand part of the trucker convoy. They literally came out on the sides of highways just to watch and be part of a grassroots movement. They wanted to see with their own eyes, not through the filter of their cell phone. Yeah. And it was breaking that false consciousness of unanimity. We were told everyone agrees, everyone loves this, everyone's with, and it was only when, and by the way, just like those protests, you say they were the beginning of the end for Ardern. In Canada, the trucker convoy was absolutely the beginning of the end of lockdown. In Canada, Trudeau overreacted. He brought in a form of martial law called the Emergencies Act, which, by the way, he hadn't even invoked during 9/11. So 9/11 was
an
not
act of terrorism.
Yeah.
act of terrorism wasn't, the airspace over the continental United States and Canada shut down completely. But no, we don't need to use the Emergencies Act for that. But these pesky people who are protesting, we got to subject them to the awesome and fearsome powers of the state. And that's exactly what Jacinda Ardern did here. She'd had enough of the protesters peacefully camped on the front lawn of Parliament and brought in the stormtroopers, in all their black gear, their helmets, their shields, their batons, their tear gas. They even had baton rounds, they call them sponge rounds, but these are less than lethal but hurt nonetheless firearms that the police were using against unarmed citizens. And they dreamed up, the media was in on it. They would put a press release out and say, pitchforks have been seen at the protest. Well, after the protest, when everything was wrecked and destroyed by the police, there was no firearms displayed. There was no weapons displayed. There was no pitchforks displayed. Normally, when you see the police do a raid on somebody, they display all of the evidence that they've gathered. We had none of that. We had none of that. We had all these people prosecuted for trespassing in a public area. It was incredible.
It's the same in Canada, the trucker convoy. There was not a single violent act ascribed to the trucker convoy. There was one shooting, but it was Trudeau's Mounties shooting our reporter, Alexa Lavoie, with one of those less than lethal riot guns. So there was a single shooting during the entire trucker saga, and it was a cop shooting our reporter. And I have to think, what are the odds? 1 million people participating in some way, 100,000 in a deeper way, and maybe 10,000 actual real truckers. And the only shooting was a Trudeau Mountie shooting a Rebel News reporter. Maybe it was just coincidence, but boy, it sure felt personal.
What astonishes me, Ezra, about this whole pandemic nightmare, really, is that how quickly Western democracies succumb to totalitarianism. It's as if we never learned anything from the 1930s, a scant 75 years ago, 80 years ago, and we've totally forgotten all of those lessons. And I've commented often that Joseph Goebbels must be cackling in his grave that his treatise on propaganda had been picked up by Trudeau, by Dan Andrews, by Jacinda Ardern, and implemented flawlessly, and we all fell for it.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, Nazi Germany, Hitler came to power in 1933, and he had to change many of the laws and the culture of Germany to bend to his plans. The Nuremberg laws of 35, if I'm not mistaken.
The Enabling Act.
Yeah. And so it was a series of things. It took really 6 years to get into the Second World War, and the Holocaust itself didn't really get fully underway for a couple more years. That, Germany was really one of the most enlightened, progressive, educated, liberal places in the world. Obviously, thank God, Canada, the United States, Australia, and New Zealand did not, obviously we didn't go full Nazi. But boy, we sure went to lockdowns and mandatory vaccinations and people accepting the fact that churches and synagogues were locked down, people accepting limits on funerals and weddings. And, of course, we didn't go the whole distance, thank God. But boy, we sure went a long way very quickly. And I'm not comparing them other than when you go down the road of authoritarianism, I think we went rather quickly. And part of it was I think people always think that the modern era is the most enlightened, and somehow they're maybe even genetically more moral people than those in history, but that's clearly not true. If anything, I don't think we're as literate in the philosophy of freedom. And of course, the media is much more controlled. Goebbels could never have dreamed of controlling the media in the manner that social media companies like Facebook, YouTube, Google, et cetera, did. I mean, literally automated machine learning censorship.
Yeah.
And if you read the community guidelines of YouTube to this day, they don't say violating the quote science, because what does that mean? They say violating health orders of different authorities. So basically, it's a political censorship. And by the way, a lot of their so-called science or community guidelines were later proved to be false. And Goebbels never had that control. The Soviets had enormous control. In Romania, you had to literally register your typewriter with the police. They would take a typing sample because each typewriter had a slightly different fingerprint, and they would keep those on file in case they found anti-government samizdat. And they would try and see, well, whose typewriter was used in this. Like, that's how authoritarian and controlling they were. But they had nothing on the modern high-tech social media censorship industry. Goebbels could never have dreamed of the censorship that the modern era has.
And this is the thing that shocks me to my core. And people say, well, why do you say shock, Cam? That's really strong language you're using. But I never could understand why the Jewish community never fought back in Nazi Germany. I could never understand how it ended in the camps and the death and the destruction of that, and how they got there. And it wasn't until I visited Jerusalem in 2014, and I went to Yad Vashem, and that museum is incredible because it teaches you as you journey through the galleries precisely how it happened and how it happened in an incremental way.
Right.
The death camps didn't just happen. They were the end of a very long process that started with segregating people on the basis of something, in this case, their Jewishness, wearing a gold star. And we very quickly in modern society ended up with the modern equivalent of a gold star, which was the reverse of that, but the vaccine passes and preventing people going to see shows or going to restaurants or congregating together unless they had their pass.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was criticized for drawing that parallel.
And the reason you were criticized is because
by liberal Jews as well. They criticized me for saying that. But I said, but these are all the hallmarks. We are stepping closer and closer to totalitarianism, and no one's fighting except a few of us.
Yeah. The reason you were criticized for making that analogy was because it hit home. And by the way, after the Second World War, the Nazi doctors who committed atrocious experiments on concentration camp inmates, a lot of the Nazi doctors were put on trial. And one of the verdicts of that trial has been called the Nuremberg Code. And it codifies how you need a patient's consent before doing medical experiments on them. And it's called the Nuremberg Code, and you can find it quite quickly. It was part of the verdict on these Nazi doctors. And the Nuremberg Code talks about informed continuous consent. The consent that can be revoked. Informed means they have to know the risk in advance. The Nuremberg Code was violated. And anyone who says, oh, people have the choice, if someone has a job that they need to feed and house their family, and you say, take the jab or you'll be fired, that is not free consent. That's not real consent.
It's coercion.
And by the way, don't think for a second that we had full informed consent. How could we, since the drugs were experimental and still are, by the way? They're required to be under testing for years to come. We don't know what the long-term effects are. So the fact that people would say, how dare you compare it to the Nuremberg Code? Well, because it's exactly what the Nuremberg Code was designed to militate against. And I think, yes, it was the incrementalism. People said, oh, well, I can get along without that. Okay, so we have to have 6 feet of separation. Okay, so we have to limit that. I think you mentioned that the vaccine passport was analogous to the Jewish Star. I would say, in a slightly different way, the mask was. And here's what I mean by that. Wearing the mask perpetuated a psychology of fear and crisis where there was none. The fact that the mask has been proved endlessly not to be particularly effective, and in some cases to be actually retrograde, was beside the point. The mask was the flag of the pandemic in two ways. It kept everyone reminded that we are in a crisis. If there were no masks, and you had no media, you wouldn't believe it's a crisis at all. You'd say, oh, it's a bad flu season. But the mask was a way of constantly terrorizing you, making you nervous. And it was also a flag that you flew if you were a supporter of the new way. Where's your mask?
That you
if you're not wearing them.
complied.
Yeah. And so the Jewish Star obviously had the reverse. It was segregating you, was putting you into the hated group. But having the Jewish Star also perpetuated the normalization of segregating and demonizing minorities. So, there's some Jews who are visibly Jewish. They would wear traditional black hats and yarmulkes and whatever. But by forcing every Jew, the most secular Jew, for example, to wear a yellow patch, that normalized segregation in the larger community. It was a psychological warfare, not just against the Jews to have them internalize their minority status, but for the rest of society, oh, those are bad people, those are different people, this is normal that we segregate against them. And so it was a psychological weapon of mass propaganda. And the bringing the masks back in has exactly the same impact. And the fact that some people to this day embrace the masks as part of their personality, I find deeply sad.
It's incredibly sad, but I don't know if you ever saw Jacinda Ardern when I won't say she was confronted, it was more of an ask by a journalist in a rather benign way. And he said, well, hang on a second, by having these vaccine passes and having, regulations in place that prevents unvaccinated people from doing things, aren't you creating two classes of citizens, the vaccinated and the unvaccinated? And she just cackled towards this journalist and said, yes, that is what it is. That's exactly what it is. And she, without even a shred of humility or embarrassment, just laughed it off that, yes, we were going to segregate people and we were going to do it this way. And this is what astonishes me the most, is that the people who were the happiest at imposing segregation and breaching civil rights and doing all of the things that we've just talked about were actually the political left, who typically fight for human rights and civil rights. And now they were actually, jackbooted little statists that were dancing all over those rights. I couldn't believe it. And to this day, I still can't believe that they did that.
Well, in Canada, we have a variety of political parties. And for example, the NDP, that's our Socialist Party, they believe in union members and solidarity forever and collective bargaining. But that party sold out their union members by agreeing to require vaccines in their collective agreements without a renegotiation, without a strike. Many of them refused to grieve their members being fired. So those people were politically homeless. The Green Party, which was about skepticism of big pharma and natural health, suddenly they were for big pharma and a mandated jab. The Liberal Party in Canada, which is sort of the mainstream left, slightly left party, their central credo is my body, my choice. Keep your hands off my body. They're talking about abortion and other things like that. But suddenly they were fine with a mandatory jab. So yes, every party sold out their heritage to join in this madness. And it reminds me of that poem by Kipling called If. And I bet you know that poem. It's a very famous poem. Let me read the first line. If you can keep your head when all about you are losing theirs and blaming it on you. Like, that's the very first line in the poem. If you can trust yourself when all men doubt you, but make allowance for their doubting too. And it's just such a wonderful poem. It's a little bit Zen. But people didn't keep their head. They panicked, and there was a collective madness. And every party sold out their base, I think. And in the United States, you had some states led by some courageous dissenting politicians. Governor DeSantis of Florida being a key example. Exactly. At least in the United States, you had 50 different approaches, and their Supreme Court weighed in. There was one wonderful case. The state of California banned singing in churches because they thought that would spread the virus. And that was quickly appealed, and the U.S. Supreme Court ruled on it quite quickly. And it's a beautiful decision. I don't have it in front of me, but you should find it. And it's a very easy read. What I love about those U.S. Supreme Court decisions is how easy there's not a lot of jargon in them. And there was this one line about how if the governor could have exemptions for shows like American Idol and, America's Got Talent that involve singing, they had to give the same exemptions for churches. As in, the Supreme Court said that, yes, the governor has the power to limit freedom in a crisis, but he can't pick and choose. And so whatever leniency he's giving his Hollywood friends, he has to give to the churches. Obviously, the ruling was much more, judiciously written than that. But isn't that the truth? So you had some pockets of, and some countries, frankly, countries that were poor countries that couldn't afford the luxury of shutting down the economy, they had some of the best health outcomes, believe it or not. And Sweden had one of the best health outcomes for. I just think, though, that I don't think most countries learned the right lessons from all this. Anyhow, we've talked a lot about the pandemic, but I tell you, just look at the headlines today. The United States of America, it seems like almost they all saw the bat signal together and they're moving back towards masks again. It's madness.
Yeah. Just touching on that Supreme Court decision that you mentioned, Justice Amy Coney Barrett actually said if a chorister can sing in a Hollywood studio but not in her church, California's regulations cannot be viewed as neutral.
Good for you. That sounds like you found the exact.
I found it. Yeah. That's beautiful.
And it's not a very long ruling. I recommend everyone read it. You'll find it very thoughtful. And what's the date on that, Cam? That was fairly early.
Yeah, that's February 2021.
That's pretty quick. That's remember they didn't. Yeah, so that's less than a year.
Yeah.
By the way, Canada, things got desperately worse in 2021, and 2022 was the invocation of that martial law called the Emergencies Act. So, sorry, 2022. That was February 2022 was the worst. So America started to, at least parts of America started to pull out of the madness earlier. Yeah.
This is the thing that astonished me in New Zealand. The first lockdown that we had, when the Prime Minister came on the television, told everybody that they were going to be locked down, that you weren't allowed to talk. She actually said not to talk to your neighbors. Stay in your house, do this. We had the police commissioner come on television and saying that if you don't stay in your house, you'll be staying in our house. And there was with a little wry grin on his face.
Yeah.
It was myself and another journalist, Barry Soper, who leaked the internal police legal opinion of the lockdown orders that said that the first lockdown was illegal. And we were hounded, abused, said we were putting people at risk by sharing that information. The government denied that the legal opinion existed, even though I actually had, a brave person inside the police leaked that information and the internal correspondence to me. So then I was able to actually ask for the documents because I knew what the file name was of them, but they still denied initially that this existed. And then when another person, a qualified lawyer, took the government to court, the court said, well, yes, all right, it perhaps was illegal, but it was the right thing to do. And they just glossed over law breaking by the government. And the same thing happened with Avi's case. Again, I was leaked documents that showed there was a political angle to trying to stop him coming to this country. And they were even using international resources to try and do that with Interpol. And when I released those documents, again, I was attacked that, these are fake. It's not real. And we had conversations, you and I and Avi, about these documents, and we proved that they were real, that it was using the Interpol, secure system. But they just broke the law, and they didn't care.
Yeah, they didn't care. And listen, I mean, I think that freedom was on the march in the 90s. I think the early years of the internet were some of the freest places and occasions in world history. And unfortunately, it's swinging back. You know, Rebel News, we recently published Avi's autobiography. We also published another book recently that we did not write. It's 1984 by George Orwell. That book is in the public domain now because the author has been passed away for a certain period of time. So like Shakespeare, his works are in the public domain. So we republished 1984. We commissioned some new illustrations to make it a beautiful version. I really recommend that people reread that book. I think a lot of people read that book in high school, but really haven't seen it since then. That book was written in 1949. So after the horrors of the Nazi regime, but also as the reality of the Soviet regime was becoming known. This was 4 years after when the Soviet Union had decided to stay in Poland and Romania and Germany, etc. And so Orwell saw the similarity between National Socialists and the International Socialists, and he saw the tools. He talked in the book about what he called telescreens, TVs that were always on, always pumping you propaganda, but also watching you. Well, how is that anything other than the spooky prediction of our own phones? He talked about newspeak, a kind of language that was hidden double meanings, and there was really, well, remember, he called the Ministry of Propaganda the Ministry of Truth. He called the Ministry of Rationing the Ministry of Plenty. The Ministry of War was renamed the Ministry of Peace. So Orwell saw it. He saw it early. He saw that it was right and left, and he saw the power of conformity. And he saw also, there's this wonderful theme in 1984 of how intellectuals often were the vanguard of evil. And he had that phrase, the proles would say, us as in the proletariat, because there are some ideas so crazy only a PhD can believe them. And again, who saved us in Canada? The truckers, working class truckers and ordinary people saved us. Whereas you find me a professor. Was there a single professor in New Zealand, Cam, who had intellectual authority? And, you know, professors are quoted on TV all the time. They're a kind of intellectual priesthood. You tell me, I don't know the answer to this. Was there a single
there was
establishment intellectual academic who spoke out?
Yeah, there was a couple, but the problem with speaking out is that they only ever got to do it once, and then they were never invited back onto the mainstream media. And so then we had, a conga line of approved professors. We had, of course, we had the famous Dr. Susie Wiles, the woman with the pink hair, who's a microbiologist who studies glowing plankton. And here she was telling people, about masks, and masks are important, and vaccines are important. And they had their useful idiots that trotted out fanciful computer scenarios that were all based on that flawed Imperial College model that they used, that had huge numbers of people who would die if we didn't do all of these things, and scared everybody. But there were some honourable ones, like Professor Des Gorman, who said, well, this is kind of crazy. It doesn't kind of match the science that I'm seeing and all that. Well, he was just sidelined. We had doctors that came out and said something. They actually had to form their own organisation, doctors speaking out about science and things like that. But they were marginalised, and it was only the advent of Voices for Freedom, a protest group organised by three ladies who have been attacked constantly since doing that, described by the Disinformation Project, the mandarins appointed by the government to point the finger and say this is misinformation or they describe these people as, they're knitters and they're traditional wives, and they braid their hair and they put this crazy stuff that's supposed to identify conspiracy theorists who are going down the rabbit hole. And that's, the pandemic might be over, but the lessons that the governments of the world learned are still being applied, and they're creating these disinformation projects. They're trying to change laws in the United Nations, in the WHO. In New Zealand, we've got the Department of Internal Affairs that wants to monitor and control news media, only have people who are registered, licensed news media who submit to the regulations of the state being able to obtain funding. It's all about control, and they've just moved, and they've moved from the pandemic into climate change now, and they're going to try and apply the same rules. Again, none of the science is supported.
What you're talking about, licensing journalists, if you are a government-approved journalist, and they use the word trusted journalist.
Trusted, yeah.
Trusted by whom? The answer is always trusted by the regulators, which means trusted by the government. And we're all supposed to be fact checkers. Every journalist is a fact checker in their own way. And the thing is, even once they're done their work, it's up to us as citizens to be the final arbiter of what's true or not. And that sounds difficult, but think about it. That's what really an election campaign is. You have two clashing worldviews. And by the way, they both can be legitimate, but you have to be able to disagree with what, one guy's fact is another guy's misinformation. I do believe that there is objective truth in the world. I'm not a complete moral relativist who says things are only what you imagine. I believe there is truth in the world, physics and math, but on social sciences and matters like global warming and matters like the pandemic, we don't have all the information. The truth is not yet found out. I believe in the theory of gravity. I believe that is absolutely true. But very few things in politics are that clear. And so we have to allow humans, ordinary citizens, to be the judges of it and not quote experts who got so many things wrong. And that's what terrifies me about these so-called misinformation units. They're not made by superhumans. They're not superior beings. And they would just be called journalists or pundits or opposition war room, political tricksters. But they call themselves misinformation units to give them some sort of special status. They're not. They are no better than you and me, but they have some sort of power over the rest of us, or at least they seek it.
Yeah, and it's spreading that, we're seeing this constantly now whenever it's like us here at Reality Check Radio, the mantra of all of the hosts that are on Reality Check Radio is to explore all sides of an issue and to let people talk and to have what I call, at the start of this show, what I call courageous discourse, where you can discuss something and disagree with somebody, but not be so polarized as to put your fingers in your ears and start screaming la, 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 which is what we are seeing constantly now in the United States, certainly in Canada, in New Zealand and Australia, in the UK, where this polarization of society into an us and them, and there's so many us's and so many thems that they all sort of overlap each other. But what it's leading to is the loss of the ability to accept that somebody else may believe something different.
Cam, I'm 51 years old, so it's been a while since I was in college. But when I was in university, about 30 years ago, there were debates all the time. Students loved to watch debates on the issues of the day. And it was sort of expected that you would attend such a debate if you were with a political club or a debating club. And if you said, no, I'm not going to debate you, you were a spoil sport, you were a chicken, you were not participating in the social, ebbs and flow, the social process. But those days are gone. Think about transgenderism.
Yes.
Think about climate change. On both of those, there is a censorship. You're called a, quote, denier, or you're called a transphobe, or you're called a conspiracy theory. Yeah, racist. So whereas when I was in college 30 years ago, there were rollicking debates all the time, and you were sort of, if you were a serious person, if you wanted to be taken seriously as a thinker, as an activist, you loved these debates. You wished you were invited. If you weren't invited, you were set your own up. That is gone. And now you have brittle students who not only don't see any debates, but they don't believe debates are a good thing. They certainly couldn't win a debate or participate because that involves having your own ideas challenged and formulating defenses and using logic and facts. What I see now is just people repeating mantras. And it's actually amazing to see what happens when people who go through the woke academies are subjected to criticism or skepticism or another point of view. They have a sort of breakdown. They lash out with name calling, and sometimes they call for the police. And I think that that's part of the problem. Let me say this about the lockdowns, Cam.
Yeah.
That was a long time coming. There were a lot of erosions in our checks and balances that had happened years or even decades earlier that allowed that to happen. Yeah. Our lack of understanding of the importance of fundamental freedoms, our lack of commitment to free speech, our lack of, there was a lot of things that had to go wrong a lot before 2020 for us to make the mistakes we did. And I think some of them can be traced back to education, and that we have the idea of trigger warnings instead of saying, kids, go to school and you will be triggered. You will hear uncomfortable thoughts. You will meet people who shock you with their ideas, and now you're going to practice responding to it. But universities are conformity factories. High schools are becoming that way, and they're even reaching earlier. So a lot of these problems go. It was a 30 years of the wrong direction got us into these problems. It's going to take 30 years to get us out, Cam.
I think it's going to take longer than that. And I'll give you a classic example is just 2 days ago, the government here, the Labor government, announced a new approach to education, particularly for important subjects like mathematics. And this is a direct quote from what they're wanting to achieve. Just to give you an example, it's quoted as a critical maths pedagogical approach uses maths to develop critical awareness about wider social, environmental, political, ideological, and economic issues. Critical maths recognizes the importance of understanding, interpreting, and addressing issues of power, social justice, and equity in the community and the wider world. Then it uses the Maori word for students, akonga, are encouraged to interrogate dominant discourses and assumptions, including that maths is benign, neutral, and culture-free. That's what the government of New Zealand wants to happen in the maths curriculum in New Zealand.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I just, I'm worried about if you're taking a Marxist, cultural Marxist approach to things like math. I fear for I'm worried about our bridges and our tunnels and our airplanes in the years to come. I don't care what race or religion my doctor is or my pilot is. I just want them to be the best at it. I'm nervous about that. And frankly, our geopolitical competitors must be laughing. I think of China, where they're very much emphasizing.
I reckon they're fermenting it.
Oh, it wouldn't surprise me because it undermines the West.
Yeah.
And, it's obvious in places like the military, when the military, only in personnel decisions, but in doctrine and priorities, to have a climate-friendly military. I'm not even kidding. I remember Barack Obama's CIA director telling Charlie Rose that one of the reasons they didn't attack the ISIS oil trucker tankers is because of climate change, because of the environment. I'm not even kidding. So they didn't. I mean, you can find that on Charlie Rose. Just Google Charlie Rose. Anyway, it was Obama's CIA director.
Yeah,
he just said that with a straight face, that he would rather not blow up an ISIS oil tanker because these were murdering terrorists, the worst people in the world. But we can't have an explosion because that's against global warming. That I don't know if that's true, but the CIA director said it was true. I have trouble believing that the CIA actually thought that way. But if the director said they did, maybe they did. That's crazy. And America's going to lose a war one day if that's how it is, because China
is
not messing around. They're not messing around.
Yeah, they don't care. They have got 1,000, 2,000, 10,000 year plan, and all we do in the West is focus on electoral cycles of 3, 4, or 5 years. And the Chinese just laugh at us. But, you've arrived here in New Zealand right in the middle of an election campaign. You must find it kind of amusing that in 2023, we've got a governing party, the Labour Party, that's using a slogan that the NDP in Canada used in 2019, unsuccessfully, I might point out. They've got exactly the same slogan. You might not have seen it yet.
Yeah, I haven't seen it yet, but I'm not surprised. I think one of the attributes of left-wing parties is that they have a globalist approach. Jacinda Ardern was, as you know, the head of a Socialist International Youth in her day. And a lot of these folks...
And a WEF graduate.
I was just going to say those were the next words out of my mouth, is why do Justin Trudeau and Jacinda Ardern and so many of these, and Emmanuel Macron, is they really synchronize with other leftists, and they do on issues, whether it's global warming or censorship. That's what scares me. Jacinda Ardern is not done. In fact, she's on to bigger things. She wants to be a global censor. She wants to export that, and there are going to be governments like my own that are receptive to it.
Yeah.
And but that's why I'm glad you're fighting the good fight, Cam. And in our own, I think everyone can be a citizen journalist, and Twitter, thank God, gives us a platform for it. And hopefully it will not become a 1984 future. We're already halfway down that road, but you got to keep hope alive.
Well, as they used to say in Germany in the war, hope dies last. But there's another slogan that I think that we need to do for those of us who are freedom fighters, those of us who are truth seekers. The Soviet Union used to have a slogan that they would indoctrinate people with, was if you see something, say something. And I think we need to learn that from history, that if we see the state doing something, that we say something about it, that we actually do what journalists are supposed to do and speak truth to power and not become the mouthpieces of the regime. Because the path that we're on now, with censorship, with control, with regulation, with all of those things, they just lead to subjugation of citizens. And we don't need to prove that that's the case. We have ample examples in history where great civilizations have succumbed to bad ideas over time. And that's what I see. It's important for us here at Reality Check Radio and for you guys at Rebel News that we are the ones that are actually doing the journalism, not the regime journalists, the regime media that are doing it for the money that they get from the government.
Well, let me say this, Cam, to all your listeners. If you've got a cell phone, guess what? You can be a journalist. Yeah. It's that easy. You've got a camera. You can report the news. You can give your opinion. You can upload it to Twitter. Like, you can be a journalist. And never before in the history of man has the barrier to entry been so low. In earlier eras, on the TV side, you would need expensive cameras and a broadcasting hub and a license. I mean, you don't need that now. And on the written side, you would need a printing press and a distribution service. You don't need that now. You can be a journalist today for free with the tools that you have.
Yeah.
And you can do it as a living, or you can do it as a hobby outside you. I would frankly recommend people start off with it as a hobby because, it's very difficult to make a living out of it, but you can. In fact, now Twitter is paying contributors based on the amount of traffic they get. So I've seen some people actually make a living wage just out of tweeting if they're interesting and entertaining and informative. So I would encourage people, and people ask me all the time, how do I do it? How do I start?
You just got to wake up in the morning and put your slippers on and get into it.
That's right. My number one piece of advice would be do it every day.
Yeah.
Because first of all, if you don't have something to say every day, maybe you should know that. And maybe you just need to scratch an itch. But if you are good at it, you'll get better every day. And I think as people will know that you're doing it every day, people will start to form a habit. They'll say, oh, what's he saying today? I know he's got a hot take. I'll take it today. So, and by the way, Twitter is great for that because it doesn't have to be long. It doesn't have to be a lengthy thing. It could be very short. And so go ahead, Cam.
No, well, we're seeing that right now in New Zealand where there's a guy who uses a pseudonym because he's in a job that he doesn't want to risk, and so he has to use a pseudonym. His Twitter handle is Thomas Cranmer, and he seems to be very well connected, seems to know how to use the Official Information Act very well, and he has revealed in the last couple of days a concerted campaign by the New Zealand government to purchase content that suits a narrative that they want to push out. And that narrative is quite broad in what he has been exposing through these documents. And I sent you a link before we got started on this interview, but basically the New Zealand government has approached a television station about a special partnership about climate change that they started on in May 2022, and then finally signed it after negotiations so that they could time it with COP27. Now, you've sent journalists to COP27, so you know what I'm talking about. Mm-hmm. They've spent $400,000 or so with, this is just one news organization that we know about, and the second one, Stuff, the largest internet news site in New Zealand. And they've been paying for content to push an agenda that also involved government ministers appearing on television shows to push that agenda. And you know what's really strange about this, Ezra? The only people talking about us, people on Twitter or Reality Check Radio, another independent media outlet called The Platform. The mainstream media today, I would have thought that would be big news, that here we have cash for content arrangements in place with media. The Herald, New Zealand Herald said nothing. There's nothing on the Stuff. The major TV channels have said nothing. The major commercial radio stations have said nothing about it. Total silence.
And first of all, I'm shocked but not surprised because the same thing is happening in Canada. And we did an access to information request in Canada seeking the list of all the media companies that received special bailouts and payments from Trudeau. And the list, there were 1,500 companies on the list. Cam, I didn't even know there were 1,500 media companies in all of Canada. Everyone in the entire industry went to get their payoffs. Some it was tens of thousands, some it was hundreds of thousands, some it was millions. And here's the one thing these 1,500 titles have in common. Not a single one reported it. Because why would you disclose to your own viewers that you're really running infomercials for the regime? And if listeners are having trouble realizing why that's bad, imagine if it was, ExxonMobil. And they just said, wink, wink, we have a particular view on global warming and carbon taxes. Or imagine if it was a tobacco company.
Well, what about, Pfizer?
Yeah. That's a huge and obvious one. And you know what, Cam, it's funny you say that. I don't know if you saw, but in January, Avi Yamini and I, with a couple of the journalists, went to Davos, Switzerland for the World Economic Forum. And we literally chanced upon Albert Bourla, the Pfizer CEO, on the street. Yeah. And I couldn't believe it. And we jumped into action. We walked with him for about 3 minutes till he managed to duck out. And we peppered him with questions. He didn't really answer them, although I think he could have. It surely wasn't the first time he heard those questions, but he just thought himself above answering them. That video was the first time, I think, that Albert Bourla was scrummed like that by anybody. Now he does media interviews 1, 2, 3, 4 times a day. Not so much today, but back then he did. And so what that showed was not just people pummeling Bourla with questions, and I thought some of our questions were good, but it was a wake-up call that, hang on, Why has no one else ever done this to Bourla? We were not rude. We didn't swear.
No, I saw the videos. You were that's the thing, Ezra. You're always exceptionally polite.
Well, I wouldn't go that far. I disagree with that. But they were substantive questions.
You're politer than me. You put it that way.
Well, we poked him. He didn't say anything, but the fact that Avi and I pummeled him for 3 minutes was I think that the reason I tell you that, Cam, is that was our most popular video we have ever made in our 9 years.
Yeah.
That video has been seen more than any other of our videos, 20 million times alone on Twitter.
Yeah.
And the reason I say that is you would never have seen those questions by the New Zealand Herald, by Stuff, by in America, CNN,
yeah.
or even Fox. Even Fox. They would have been much more careful because you don't bite the hand that feeds you. And there was a multi-billion-dollar sales effort going on. And Pfizer is a major sponsor of media, major advertiser, major sponsor. And if you wonder why you never saw Albert Bourla scrummed by anyone else other than Avi Yamini and myself, 2 citizen journalists, neither of whom went to journalism school, neither of whom worked for a big regime media. Yeah. It's because of what you just pointed out here in New Zealand. These secret payments. And of course, Cam, this revelation is not being reported because they're all in on it. They are all in on it. It is a club and you are not invited.
And this is a criticism that comes up about yourself, Avi, Rukshan, that you are, because you are able to do those things, through fair means or foul. People say that Rebel News is controlled media, that you were actually given access at Davos, and it was just so that there could be, look like that there was some opposition media there, and that actually you're just grifters. How do you cope with those constant criticisms of Rebel News, your business model, how you do, in interviews like that, where you're trying to get Albert Bourla to talk, and yet you're accused of being controlled media that are actually on the side of the state? I mean, it would annoy the hell out of me if it was said to me.
I saw a few people say that about that Bourla interview. Like I said, 20 million people saw that on Twitter alone. And I saw a few people saying that must have been set up.
Yeah.
Well, let me just give you some background. We went to the World Economic Forum in Davos. We were not given credentials. Yeah. We were standing outside the security perimeter. We were not allowed to go in. All the VIPs are in. It's like a castle with a drawbridge, really.
Yeah.
And we are out on the street. It was cold. It was very cold. And basically what we did all day was wait and try and catch people as they came and went. We caught John Kerry very quickly. We caught Brian Kemp, the governor of the state of Georgia in the United States. We waited for 2 hours as Greta Thunberg tried to outwait us. And then we actually walked with Greta for 10 minutes and talked to her for 10 minutes.
I saw that one too.
Yeah, and I thought her answers were silly and frustrating, but at least she talked to us. It was absolutely good luck that we caught Bourla because the name tags are fairly small. You've got to spot people or spot their name tags, and then you've got to very quickly think of questions. Like Tony Blair. I bumped into Tony Blair, the British PM. If you had 5 seconds to think of questions for him, could you do it? You'll notice when in the video of me scrumming Bourla, I sort of ran out of questions after 30 seconds, and luckily Avi jumped in because I wasn't ready to think, okay, what should I ask Pfizer? I think that was Albert Bourla's worst day of the year. And anyone who thinks that was set up, I think that's watch the video. I remember the questions I asked. I said, why did you keep it secret that your virus didn't stop transmissibility? Right? I said, you knew it before you admitted it. Why did you decide to keep it secret? I'm sorry, that's a devastating question if I do say so myself. We said, why did you lie about the efficacy? You said it was 90%, then 80%. So we said, will you apologize? How is that serving Pfizer's interest? I think one of us said something like, you know, did you need a yacht or something? What do you think about when you're on your private jet or your yacht? I think Avi said something about returning money for, faulty products. We peppered him with the most vigorous question. I mean, if someone has a tough question that they can think of that we didn't ask, I'd like to hear it.
Yeah.
That we pummeled him, and I think he made it look worse because he didn't talk. And he tried to escape us, as you saw. He tried to get out of the public street. The whole thing was about 3 minutes long. But it felt for him, I'm sure, like 3 hours. No, that was a combination of luck and patience. We waited and waited, and we had no idea who we could get. And we had to sort of spot their name tags. I mean, I recognized Albert Bourla because he's on TV so much.
Yeah.
But many of the names, I wouldn't have known Brian Kemp, the governor of Georgia. I just don't know what he looks like. So we had a team there whose job was to sort of spot name tags. And again, this was only for people who left the security perimeter. We were not allowed in any of the official venues. There are some sort of kiosks outside the official venues where we were allowed to go. But I walked into the BlackRock venue and they basically shooed us out of there. And they called security. Now, I left the building. I didn't want to trespass. Yeah. I didn't want to be charged. By the way, I should tell you that Swiss police are very respectful of civil liberties. We were stopped a couple times by Swiss police. Yeah. And we just said we're journalists. We have not broken the law. And they said, you're right. And they let us go. I'm used to arguing with police in Canada, in the United Kingdom, and I've seen Avi do it in Australia. These Swiss police were as gentle as you could imagine. And they absolutely did not stop us from scrumming anyone. There were heavily armed police where we met Greta, where we met Albert Bourla, and they didn't do a thing.
Yeah.
Whereas I promise you, if that had happened in New Zealand, Canada, the UK, Australia,
it wouldn't have got near them.
You're right. And so let me say one more thing. It's hard to get to Davos. You have to fly to Zurich, then take the train. The WEF books every single hotel room in the town of Davos. You cannot even stay in Davos. You have to stay 1 or 2 towns away and take the train or drive in every day. They make it very hard to get there. From New Zealand, it's probably $3,000 to get there. Yeah. And good luck finding an Airbnb. But if you get there, it really is a festival of VVIPs. It really is the greatest gathering of big shots in the world. And you're not going to get into their inner sanctum, but you will get on the street. So again, if there's a citizen journalist out there, I know what I just said about $3,000 to get there. That's a huge obstacle, but we crowdfunded. And so you talked about crowdfunding. Cam, the way I see it is there's 3 ways you can run a media company. One is you can do what the New York Times and the Washington Post does.
Get a benefactor.
That's right. The richest man,
a billionaire who's in on it.
Yeah, it's right. Jeffrey Bezos of Amazon owns Washington Post. Carlos Slim, or Elon Musk for that matter.
Yeah.
So a lot of oligarchs buy media as like a plaything. So you could work for a billionaire, and that's great as long as you do exactly what he says. You'll be fine. Another way is to work for a large corporate media. Trouble with that is they have ads to sell to Pfizer. And they're often exposed to public pressure through other companies in their conglomerate. So you can go to work for a corporate media company, but prepared to be very vanilla on all sides for the rest of your life. They'll be very woke. Another way is
let your audience fund you.
Yeah,
that's
right.
Yeah,
that's right. And Rebel News, the average donation to Rebel News is $58.
Yeah.
And so that means we have a lot of people chipping in, but it also means there's no one donor who's so big that he can call me up and say, Ezra, fire Avi. And if someone tried to phone me up and say, fire Avi, I would say, oh, now I know that Avi's hitting the target.
He's effective.
Yeah, that's right. And no one tries to do that because they know I'll react the opposite way. I didn't always work for a citizen-funded company. I did work for an oligarch once. I worked for a TV station for a few years, owned by a billionaire named Pierre-Carl Pelado. The company was called Quebecor.
Yeah.
And it was wonderful. I didn't have to worry about making payroll. I got well paid. It was a great job. I knew there were a few things I wouldn't talk about because it would upset the big man, but I was actually given a lot of freedom. Listen, I loved it. It's great work if you can get it, but just be prepared that if your oligarch boss disagrees with you, you are going to be silenced. Now, maybe for some people, they don't care. They just want a job. Maybe they're talking about sports or the weather and they're really not controversial. But if you are a political commentator or a news reporter, if you're trying to speak truth to power, if you're trying to tell the contrarian side of the story, if you're a skeptic about anything mainstream, don't work for a conglomerate. And maybe you can find an oligarch who supports your point of view, but I'm not sure. I don't know a lot of them.
They're golden handcuffs, though, aren't they?
That's right. And I work a lot harder now because we have to crowdfund every day. It's a lot harder than just showing up to work in a luxury studio, but I'm a lot freer and it feels great. And I would encourage people, to express themselves that way. I would warn them against trying to make a living out of this. I would warn people, start small, start as a hobby. But I would say it's been wonderful. And as long as I stay with the people, they're going to stay with me. That's what I believe.
Yeah, and I'm exactly the same position. My audience are the ones that I value, not any advertisers or secret funders. Not that I've got any. I just value the contributions that my audience provides me, and it can be as small as a comment saying, thanks for saying that, thanks for interviewing Ezra, thanks for doing that. Those are the things that matter the most to me. We've got subscribers, they're the people that I listen to. And if they stop subscribing, that means I'm doing something wrong. And that's my guidance that I have. If I look at the subscribers, if it's going up, I must be doing something right. If it's going down, I must be doing something wrong, and I go and correct it. And that's how newspapers started. That's the thing. I was involved in a court case where I was being sued, and you know this very well. What it's like, you've been sued several times like me. I had the person the protagonist up against me was claiming I wasn't a journalist, and I had to prove that I was a journalist to the judge. And then when I did, and I said, well, here's all of my writing, here's this, here's that, and, explained that pamphleteers, and then, started with typewriters, got printing presses and etc. I'm just using the modern tools like you talked about before, cell phones and things like that. And, the protagonist then said, oh, but you're not a good journalist. And I said to the judge, there's no requirement in the law to be a good journalist. You just have to be a journalist. And I actually had to get a court judgment that declared that I was a journalist, and that settled the argument. But I should never have had to have done that in the first place.
Well, that's the times we're in these days. They want to regulate journalism as a kind of priesthood or profession so they can stop citizen journalists from talking back. Yeah. Well, Cam, it's a pleasure to see you in action and to be on your show, and it's great to be in New Zealand. I'm not over the jet lag. I just landed this morning.
You need a rest, and I've taken up more than enough of your time. But you enjoy.
It's a pleasure, though.
You enjoy the rest of the day, and we'll catch up in person on Friday for Avi's book launch.
I'm really looking forward to it. Looking forward to meeting you in person. Looking forward to meeting New Zealanders who are contrarian, who are nonconformist, who want to know the other side of the story, and who believe in freedom. And I believe that New Zealand historically has been a place for freedom and, frankly, for nonconformists. And I hope that spirit can be rekindled.
And that's the whole ethos of Reality Check Radio. And I think there's a good alignment with what we're doing, with what Rebel News is doing. And that's the reason why I wanted to have you on the show today.
Well, I'm very grateful to you. And thanks for being such a supporter of Avi. And what I would say to your listeners is, even if you don't agree with Avi, the fact that he's there is healthy for public discussion. And it's in the public interest to have contrarian, troublemaking journalists. And it keeps politicians on their toes. It challenges sacred cows. And every once in a while, we get something right, and it makes a difference. And
Well,
we were on the right side of.
More often than not, Ezra, we get things right. More often than not.
Yeah. Well, thanks very much for this, Cam. It's great to talk to you.
I appreciate it. Thank you very much, Ezra.
Cheers.
Ezra has made a career of challenging the mainstream and politicians, and Rebel's fight against the excesses of the Trudeau regime in Canada is vitally important. That's why he's here in New Zealand to share details of that fight. Join us at Avi's book launch in Auckland tomorrow and meet the three amigos in person. Do you think the same? Don't forget to send comments to inbox@realitycheck.radio or text to 2057.
You're listening to The Crunch with Cam Slater, right here on RCR, Reality Check Radio.
Now it's time for a favourite, Cam's Buddies. I've decided to focus on the next few weeks leading up to the election on what my buddies think of various political leaders. I regularly catch up with these mates, and they always give me their unvarnished views on anything, even if they disagree with me. My producer has them already lined up, so let's hear what Cam's Buddies have to say about ACT Party leader David Seymour. Welcome to Cam's Buddies, Marcus.
How you doing, Cam?
Yeah, good. We talked about Christopher Luxon last week. This week, the leader that I want to talk about is David Seymour. What are your impressions, and what do you think he would be like as Deputy Prime Minister?
Well, same as the answer I gave last time for Luxon, actually, useless. But out of all of the leaders out there, David Seymour, in my opinion, is the most disappointing. I mean, I was an ex-supporter at the last elections, and I donated to the party and believed he thought I believed that he was looking after the little guy. You know, he was out there for the firearm license owners and all that sort of thing, and he was talking a big talk. To his credit, back then, he was actually doing some stuff as well, like he voted against certain bills and that sort of thing. There's a lot of stuff I didn't like him doing. But, yeah, as it turned out, that was all just pretend, you know. As far as what he'll be like as the Deputy Prime Minister, I'd say probably quite good, actually. I think he'll be half decent. He's not a bad politician, let's say.
Yeah, do you think he'd be able to stand up to Christopher Luxon?
I think he'd walk all over Christopher Luxon.
Well, Christopher Luxon...
David Seymour, it strikes me as being the nerd at school that got bullied all the time, and now he's got a little bit of power and he's taken out on everyone else. That's the sort of guy he strikes me as.
On Tuesday, Christopher Luxon came out and said that he's got no interest in any of ACT's zero carbon policies or Treaty of Waitangi policies. Seems a bit arrogant. I wonder how David Seymour is going to cope with that.
I think this is all just smoke and mirrors at this stage of the game, mate. I mean, he's probably talking a big talk as well, and when it comes down to it at the table, Luxon's going to have to obviously concede a lot of things because David will be in the driving seat most likely. I'm hoping what happens is actually what's happening in the polls now, where Winston Peters and NZ First are getting up into the game, and they're going to ruin the party. You know, it's going to be a three-way coalition. That would be fantastic for New Zealand.
Well, it's one of my things that I'm hoping for, that we do have a three-way coalition, because I think a two-way coalition with National and ACT would be, okay, but I just don't think that there's enough of a care for what's happening in New Zealand and more of an interest in grandstanding for globalism and the various agendas that are out there with that, because Luxon's on board with that. ACT, David Seymour is on board with that as well.
Yeah, I just find it really frustrating how the average New Zealander now is happy with mediocre performance, you know. We seem to have had all of our expectations drummed out of us, and we'll accept mediocre now. And everyone is so focused on getting rid of Labor. They say we have to vote for National or ACT now because they're right up in the polls. We have to vote for them to make sure Labor's going to get out, not realising that replacing one bad government with another bad government isn't going to do anything. I mean, you could argue that they're better than Labor, but I think, like you just mentioned, I mean, they're both globalist parties, and they're going to do what they're told to do, just like Labor's doing. They might do it a little bit more subtly, and they might do it behind closed doors, but they're still going to sell us out. And this is the problem: is that we're so focused on getting rid of Labor, we've lost sight as to actually what we can do with the vote we've got this election. And I mean, Winston Peters is going to be in there. He's 4% in the lowest poll and 5.8 in the highest poll. So, yeah. And that's early in the campaign. He's going to build on that. So he's going to be in government. So if more people could see that actually a nationalist approach at this point in time in history is a fantastic idea, we could possibly separate ourselves a little bit from the dominating people that are pulling the strings overseas, you know?
Absolutely. The David Seymour talks a big game. You know, he went around the country talking about freedom of speech, but when a whole lot of people turned up on Parliament's doorstep to talk about freedom of speech, he was nowhere to be seen.
Right. Yeah, you're preaching to the converted here. I mean, David, like I said at the beginning, David Seymour is the biggest disappointment from my point of view as to all the politicians in Parliament right now, because he was standing up for the low guy, the ones that are downtrodden and that sort of thing. He was talking a big game, and he did back in the day sort of stand up a little bit and fast forward a little bit, and all of a sudden he just doesn't give a stuff. I mean, I wrote him a letter and told him one poll came out after he came out publicly, sort of dissing all the unvaccinated and blaming all the unvaccinated for the pandemic and that sort of carry on. I sent him a letter because he went down on the polls back then. I can't remember when that was, 2021 or something. And I sent him a letter saying, I bet you're wondering where all your support base has gone. And, I mean, he bought the end-of-life bill, and his whole slogan with that is, your body, your choice. You know, he was going out there saying, who am I to tell you what to do with your body? If you want to kill yourself when you're getting old and decrepit, then go ahead. The next minute, COVID comes along and he's just singing the party line, you know, the global party line. Oh, go get vaccinated, blame the unvaccinated for all the pandemic, all that sort of thing. He didn't care. He didn't give a stuff about anyone's choice. So, I mean, he's shown his true colours, and like you say, he talks a big talk, but when it comes down to it, now I think he's got a little bit of power, and he's got a little bit of friendly vibes going on with the media, and I don't think that's by any accident. I think now he just doesn't care about his core values now. He doesn't have that principle factor, and he's just doing whatever he can do to get power, just like all the rest of them.
That's the problem with MMP, isn't it? It gives us brown bread. In fact, it probably gives us gluten-free brown bread type politicians. They're not a whole lot. There's not a lot whole appetizing about that, is there?
Everybody goes on, but it's better than first past the post. Again, I highlight the fact that we've all been bred to accept mediocrity. We've all been bred to accept, not the best, that's okay. And so, I mean, personally, I thought at the time when we voted for MMP that single transferable vote would have been a better system, but it got no marketing and no backing, because at least that way you don't waste your vote like you do with MMP.
Well, the system was rigged. The politicians made sure that they split the vote with four choices so that everyone would have an argument over which was better and what, letting MMP continue on through the process. We've had two referenda to deal with this, and MMP, and they rigged it both times. MMP is here to stay, so I guess we have to find a better way to do things.
Yeah, well, I mean, we have to realise that we're in control of it, and we can't let the media and these guys be in control of it. We have to think smart, Right, this election, vote New Zealand First for your party vote, and vote for whoever you want in your local area as your MP. It doesn't matter who they're for, because the New Zealand First party vote, the more they get, the more they'll have power in government with ACT and National, hopefully. Whereas if they're 4 or 5% or just 5%, ACT and National may be able to leave them out on the benches on their own and not even use them.
Yeah, that's the thing, isn't it? We've got to be sensible about it to make sure that that voices that represent us are actually at the table in a position to effect change. And
the thing is as well, just coming back to David Seymour, I voted for him last time, like I mentioned, and I had expectations of how he would perform, and he didn't perform like that. And so therefore he's gaining my wrath now. And I'm only one person, but if more people were like that, same thing applies to Winston Peters. I mean, I was very disappointed how he handled himself throughout the pandemic as well. and what he said, and he's sort of addressed that. Well, not sort of, he has addressed it, and he regrets it. And he's talking a big game now as well. But again, I'm going to hold him to the fire as well and see whether he performs as to what he says he's going to do now in the future. So I think more people need to be like that. They need to actually be less partisan about their voting and more intellectual and think about actually the results of their vote and where they're going and what they're doing. Because MMP isn't a two-party system, but we've sort of turned it into that.
Well, that's exactly right. Truer words have never been spoken. Thanks very much, Marcus, for your time and your thoughts on David Seymour. And I'll look forward to talking to you next week.
Wait, mate.
Thank you. Welcome to Cam's Buddies.
G'day, Cam. You good?
Yeah, I'm good. How are you, Jimmy?
I'm okay. I'm a lot more buoyant with yesterday's poll, Mr. Slater.
Well, there's been 5 polls that are showing that same direction.
Yeah, well, the appearance of a better gap is coming, rather than being such on a knife edge.
Well, given those polls and the poll from yesterday that shows that David Seymour is on track to possibly becoming the Deputy Prime Minister, I thought I'd ask Cam's buddies what they thought about David Seymour. What are your thoughts?
I personally think Seymour is a very good politician. He's, in my opinion, he's the only politician that clearly articulates his ideas and can explain them clearly. The left side of the house tend to just talk in waffle language that makes no sense.
Yep.
And Mr. Luxon won't actually take a particular stand on. He sort of talks in, language that leaves a gap open for him to walk back on. Whereas Mr. Seymour and also your good mate Winston both are making quite clear stands, and it's very good. I'm very happy about it.
What about Christopher Luxon coming out on Tuesday saying he's got no interest in talking about acts, policies with regard to climate change and treaty? What do you think about that?
Well, it's really up to the voters, I think, that if ACT and potentially Winston get enough power, then Luxon is going to be forced to look at it. Whereas if National is a major player, then he can be like that. I mean, it's just MMP.
Is that a desirable outcome to empower ACT and possibly New Zealand First in order to have a check against the globalist sort of woke waffle that comes out of the National Party these days?
Well, there's people in the National Party that could be in the Labor Party, right? We all know that. They could jump between parties. It wouldn't matter.
Yeah, Christopher Luxon's one of them, yeah.
So if we want to bend their arms and force them to do stuff that we right-wing people agree with, then we have to empower the right-hand side of the house. So, also Luxon, I guess, the National Party has to be a centre party to grab the majority.
Yeah.
So they can't say things that'll freak out all the housewives. So they, I guess it's to be expected. And during whatever the election result, there'll be negotiations, and that's where this stuff will happen.
Is it a case though that that this right and left idea is now gone? It's more freedom versus those who oppose freedom.
I think it's definitely gone from, say, how it was 20 years ago or 30 years ago.
Yeah.
The globalists versus the nationalists is more of a thing probably. But there's still, in my opinion, there's the people who want freedom and there's the people who want the state to control everything. And, we still have to vote and get the results we want. We'll just get led further down where we're going, slow demise.
We need to vote for parties that are actually going to make it into Parliament, though, aren't we?
Yeah, you don't want to waste your vote. So, Winston looks to be certainly around that 5%. It'd be good to get a more clear gap so you can be certain if you're going to vote for Winston. But ACT's ACT's probably got a lot. What do you think, land between 12 to 15, maybe, something like that?
They should do, but it's interesting because I had a discussion with David Seymour in 2021 after the election.
Yeah.
And I said to him, well, what next for the ACT party? And he said to me that he thought that ACT was always going to be a 10% party and never going to be more than that. And he's now polling around, in that 12 to 15% range, which is higher than what he thought his party was going to get.
Well, I think the last few years and the severe loss of freedoms and the massive government control have pushed people over into areas that they never used to think about, potentially, don't you think?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. The pandemic forced us to abandon this left-right dynamic that a lot of people seem stuck on. And I'm certainly not someone who would describe myself as right-wing anymore, although, mainstream media likes to label me as that. I've got more in common with people that have previously voted Green or Maori Party, but have now embraced freedom, and we're kind of like can't be pigeonholed into a right or left paradigm.
No, I'm the same. I mean, I'm certainly really quite liberal on some things. Like, I'm not a conservative at all.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't say I'm basically an economic right winger, but fiscally socially liberal.
Yeah, fiscally conservative, socially liberal. I guess I'd be in the same sort of boat on that.
With a genuine economic bent that's not for the Green Party, like actual real green policy, not communism.
Yeah. Well, you're a hunter too, and I'm a hunter. We want clean forests and clean water and those sorts of things. We're not against those sorts of things. We're just against how they want to do it.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, you're right. The left-right thing is gone, and that's probably, from the shape of the house, it'll always be there, built into the political spectrum, but maybe they need to turn into a big circle, as the shape of the house can.
Yeah, the trouble with the big circle is that fascism and communism end up at the 11 o'clock and 5 to 11, 5 to 12 and 5 past 12. The two evils. There's not much difference between the two, and that's what worries me the most.
And also, the left saying this is the most right-wing party since Roger Douglas, and potentially it might be. There is a lot of really strong economic policy from the ACT party in particular. But we've got to kick back against Ardern's massive leftism, kick back the other way, and then the next election maybe more centrist, potentially. Just it's a knee-jerk. And then David could be back to his 10%. Isn't that a possibility?
Yeah, I think we do need to find more of the middle of the road because it's
we can't just jerk from extreme side to each side, each election. Just your country won't progress. It's just terrible.
No, that's right. We can't keep flip-flopping or as I say, going from one side of the coin to the other side of the coin, but it's the same coin.
Yeah, exactly. We just need to work. One policy I like of Seymour's is the KPIs, measuring the bureaucrats. I think that's insane that doesn't happen. How do you know how anything's going? Well, imagine taking all the gauges off your car.
Well, you just take private enterprise. Sales reps get paid commission based on sales. That's their KPI. If they don't sell, they don't get paid. In your business, if you don't measure things properly in your business, there's going to be all sorts of wonky houses around the place, isn't there?
Well, there might be still a few wonky houses, mate. But yeah, every industry needs it. And the fact that central government thinks it's okay not to do it is absolutely mind-blowing, given how much public money they have access to.
Well, I was always taught that what gets measured gets done.
Yeah, so look, terrible government, no measurement. So that statement was right, I think that's spot on. Yeah, that's one policy I really like.
Yeah, your overriding impression of David Seymour is he's saying the things that resonate with you, that you're very pleased with where he's at.
Oh, look, I'm not a single issue voter. I don't certainly agree with everything that they say, but there's no politician I agree with everything, and I don't think ever anyone should be like that. And if a single issue voters are just seeing the world too simplistically, but a good national government with a strong ACT, and potentially Winston, would be a great result for our country, in my opinion, certainly after what we've just been through for 6 years.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm in agreement with you. So thanks for sharing that with Cam's buddies. And I look forward to calling you next week.
Thanks, Cam. Have a good evening.
No worries. Thank you. Welcome to Cam's buddies, Jack.
G'day, Cam. How are you?
I'm fantastic, box of birds. Last week we talked about Christopher Luxon. I'd like your impressions on David Seymour and the possibility that he may, in fact, be the Deputy Prime Minister in a few short weeks.
Yeah, interesting, isn't it? I like David Seymour. I like people that work hard, and he certainly works hard. What else do you want to know?
Well, I'm just interested.
It looks like a foregone conclusion that they're going to be the government. It's now a matter for me to personally choose whether I vote for him or Winston Peters.
Well, I think go ahead, carry on.
Yeah, but he's already said that he won't work with Winston, so how's that going to... And if they get enough seats, they're not going to include Winston. So would I be wasting my vote voting for Winston? I mean, these sort of things will be running through everybody's mind.
Yeah, I think that David Seymour's been trying to walk that statement back with some nuances, having his deputy try and explain it for him. But my understanding of politicians is that if they're forced to choose between sitting on the crossbenches and having no power or having power by sharing it with someone else, they'll pick power sharing every time. I guess it just comes down to how many other people will back Winston Peters and force David Seymour's hand into accepting that he's going to have to do something with the cunning old fox.
Yeah, I share your thoughts there 100%.
It really comes down to the cards that were dealt.
I know. And things will change as we get closer to the election. So either way, Labor are out as far as I can see. I don't think whatever they do, they've got a hope in hell.
Well, right now they're shedding support to almost every. Right now they're shedding support to almost every party. But I disagree with that, Jack. I think you've got a lot to share because you've been around a lot longer than most of us.
Yeah, so that's an advantage and a disadvantage. As you know, as you get older, you become far more cynical.
Yeah, I don't call it cynicism. I call it realism.
Yeah, okay. Well, I suppose that's another name for it. I hate reality. I hate cynicism. I suffer from both those illnesses.
Hey, I'm not sure they're illnesses, Jack. I really don't. I think we need people that are prepared to speak their mind.
We're going to be fed a hell of a lot of rubbish now over the next... How long is it now till the election? I can't even remember.
October the 14th, so it's about 6 weeks.
Real close.
6 weeks or something like that. 6 weeks of... 6 weeks of bloviating politicians.
We're going to be fed so much rubbish. And whatever happens, nothing's going to change here that quickly. As we know, yes, Minister is alive and well.
There was a documentary.
The guy sitting down in Wellington will actually still be in the same job, doing the same things. And whereas David said he's going to get rid of them, where are they going to go?
Well, they'll just materialise in another government department somewhere.
Yeah, I mean, how do you get rid of people? I mean, I've had my business for 50 years. We're in our 51st year. It was easy to get rid of people. I was known for firing so many people back, but not so much these days. It's hard to get rid of people. So you can make these grandiose statements, but in reality, not so real.
Well, David Seymour joked about sending Guy Fawkes in, but I think that's a poor example because Guy Fawkes didn't succeed. But I'd be a big fan of. I'd be a big fan.
I never thought of that side of it. You're right.
Yeah, I would have thought
he does share my kind of humour.
Yeah, I would have thought the old Roman method of decimation might be the best way to get rid of some of these civil servants.
Yes. Oh, bureaucracy is just so bad in the little spheres of bureaucracy that I share. It's hopeless. So you extrapolate on that, and you think, man, it's just bad everywhere. Once again, my cynicism prevails.
Yeah, I'm not sure it's cynicism. Again, I think it's realism, Jack. Thanks so much for your comments there on David Seymour. I look forward to talking to you next week.
See you later.
Thank you. Welcome to Cam's Buddy, Stephen.
Hello, Cam. How are you doing?
Fabulous, actually, all the time. I'm fabulous all the time. Thank you very much.
Oh, that's great. I'm enjoying listening to your show.
Well, I'm glad that you can participate for the first time in Cam's Buddies, because I always value your opinion on things. And this week we're going to talk about your views, not my views, your views on David Seymour and the possibility he could end up being the Deputy Prime Minister.
Yes, well, look, I think he's been doing pretty well, and the results speak for themselves to a large degree. He's sort of gone from a party of 1 MP to around 10, and looks like he could increase significantly in the coming election.
Yeah,
I guess what... Sorry.
No, you go.
I like that he's promising to address the issue of government regulation, as I guess, in my opinion, that's the biggest issue facing New Zealand at present. You know, it's really hard to do anything that involves interacting with a government department. And I guess for the average person, we think we can just avoid dealing with the government. But, you know, all these rules and regulations, I think, are having just the opposite effect and are quite a big handbrake on our economy and business.
Yeah, there was a comment in the media on Tuesday by Kirk Hope from, I think, Business New Zealand, where he was explaining that the productivity statistics for New Zealand are the worst they've ever been since records began.
Yes. Well, I don't doubt that at all. And I can give you a quick example. About a month ago, I had to register a company for GST. And, of course, you can do that online now, which is great. And so I did that, and I waited, and yesterday, about a month later, I finally got a reply, and they basically said that unless I could provide them some more information about what we're planning to do, they were going to decline the application to be registered. And so, you know, that's how hard it is to comply with the law and actually to pay the government tax. And I think, it's just difficult in dealing with a lot of government departments and all the rules and regulations that they have. So I'm glad that he's saying that and that he's going to really try and tackle this problem.
What about Christopher Luxon on Tuesday coming out and saying that he doesn't agree and is unlikely to support ACT's policies regarding climate change and Treaty of Waitangi?
Well, I guess, they're going to have to agree to do something about those things because those are huge issues facing the country as well. And the whole rules and regulations around, carbon and climate change, that is hugely difficult to navigate as well. And I don't really think it's making, a big difference. It's just a transfer of wealth, really. So, I guess I would tend to agree with ACT Party policy on that more than what National's proposing.
I think National's proposing to go along with what the World Economic Forum and the United Nations and all the other woke agenda that's out there, they seem to be, locking in as being globalists and being dictated to by all these other organisations.
Yes, absolutely. And that is, a huge problem for the country. We're a small country. We're a green country already. And, sure, we should deal with the pollution, I agree. But all of these other things are becoming very, very difficult.
I agree with you there on dealing with pollution. We all want clean air, clean water, clean forests,
yes.
It's a given. We all want that. I think we just disagree on how we go about doing that. I'm not sure that the Green Party or Labour, for that matter, have any idea on actually dealing with things in a proper economic fashion, that it doesn't beggar our nation while we try and virtue signal and tell the world that we're cleaner and greener than everybody else, so please buy our products, when the reality is people are buying products on price point and not on anything else.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And, you know, I think a lot of people think that David Seymour and the ACT Party is for the wealthy. But in my opinion, it's actually the least well-off in the country that have been most adversely affected by all of these different rules and regulations. And while as average people, we don't need to deal with a lot of the government departments, it is affecting business so much that means the economy is not going very well, and that is affecting all of us. And you see it in the rental market very much so, that all the rules around, healthy homes and everything, while well-intentioned, have resulted in it being very hard to rent a house, in my view.
Well, then there's the other extent where we've got all of these taxes that are applied to fuel, for example, where petrol's now over $3 a litre in Auckland. And as a consequence, the poorest among us are being forced by government policy and the consequences of government policy into substandard public transport, where the promises for fixing those are decades, if not multiple decades away.
Yes, and I guess the other thing is education. I think the ACT Party have got a good track record on education. I did think the charter schools were very beneficial for lots of disadvantaged. Yep. And it's a shame that they disappeared, and I hope that they can bring them back. But more importantly is deregulate the whole education system, because the results for New Zealand in education, I think, are declining dramatically every year. And unless we do something about that soon, I'm actually on a board of trustees, and last night we had a meeting, and the principal was talking about all the different mandatory requirements that the school is getting from the Ministry of Education. And not a single one of them had anything to do with learning and achieving. And I think that's the whole problem, is that teachers and principals are all focused on following all these rules and, making everything safe. Not that it really does that, but no one's actually learning and achieving what they should be learning. I really hope that we can bring the focus back on learning and achieving, and just go easy on all of these mandatory requirements.
Well, I guess we need to back these parties like the ACT Party, possibly New Zealand First, in order to temper the globalist and woke agenda of the National Party.
Yes, yeah. I guess they're going for the popular vote, but something needs to be done. And this is part of the issue, I guess, with the whole thing of politics. But look, I hope David does well in the election. And more than that, I hope he does something to reduce the size of government and let our great little country start flourishing well again.
Yeah, and I agree with you on that, Stephen, and I thank you for calling in to Cam's Buddies, and hopefully I'll have you on again sometime soon.
Thank you, Cam.
No worries. Thank you.
All right. See you next time. Bye.
See you. Bye. My buddies can be pretty brutal at times, and that's why I love their thoughts. They never hold back, and they're unafraid to challenge me or my thinking. There are many times my views and reckons have been formed by these free and frank discussions with my buddies. Let us know in the comments sent to inbox@realitycheck.radio or text to 2057 which leader you think should be the focus of next week's Cam Buddies.
Would you like to be a part of reviving honest media? At RCR, we're on a mission to do just that. We report on critical, censored stories and hold those in positions of power to account. As Paul Brennan says, it's a good mission. Now there's an easy way to support RCR and at the same time receive some amazing benefits. Our Foundation Membership Club is here. As a member, you'll enjoy a host of exclusive benefits, including a daily bite-sized news digest, a backstage pass to RCR, and discounted merchandise. Find out all you need to know about our Foundation membership now at www.realitycheck.radio.
Our text machine is now live. Send us your thoughts by texting your message to 2057. That's 2057. So get in touch with us now.
All right, it's that time of the show for general feedback, questions, suggestions, and comments about my guests and my interviews. And tonight we have a poem as well. But first we get Kikila, who has sent in a very lengthy email that she calls a diatribe, but let's just get into that. Hi, Cam. I've caught up with some podcasts. I'm a long-time Whale Oil BFD subscriber, and I've always liked reading your views, even though I don't always agree with them. A great podcast pivot as well. It's nice to hear different views rather than the dense, monotone drone from the mainstream. This diatribe is really in response to you inviting questions of you and your guests, so here are mine. When you refer to New Zealand being in decline, how do you define this? My measure is there are fewer jobs than you can do to buy a house and raise a family. This was standard even 10 years ago, but less possible today as fewer and fewer occupations can put you into home ownership. There's a good observation there, Kikila. Here's another question she asked. Why do you think political pundits on the left and right downplay the impact of lockdowns and run the narrative they were relatively successful when we're now poorer and that most societal measures have got worse? Well, I think it's down to the fact that they are locked into that and are only looking at the alleged health outcomes without looking at the economic impacts of lockdowns. And now there is more and more evidence building that the economic impact of lockdowns have had health impacts as well. Another question that she asked. So I noticed that a lot of your friends' comments on the Cam's Mate segment are very sympathetic to people who are less well off. Do you think this is representative of a collapse in cultural confidence, i.e., it is too hard to make it here, so we need a bigger safety net? Or is it the left have been successful in making well-off people feel guilty about doing well in life? And why do people feel like this, even though the welfare state has got larger and more generous, and for some people on welfare, their issues are self-inflicted? And on that, I'd comment and say that my mates think deeply about the effects and consequences of political policies and decisions on the poorest amongst us. And that's part of why they're concerned and why they involve themselves in the program. Now, Kikila asks a question for a unionist like Matt McCartan. How can you advocate for your members if your position relies on more members and more subs, which makes you personally richer? There wouldn't be migrant exploitation if we didn't need so many at the price paid for their labour. And adds, how much collusion is happening between unions and companies at the expense of the worker? We have more unions, but wages aren't rising in line with inflation. And those are questions that Matt McCartan could probably best answer. She adds, Nick Mowbray has been tweeting videos and pics of a new manufacturing plant he's building in Los Angeles. Given that it is a Western country, it would be interesting to know what he thinks it would take for that kind of operation to be built here. Or maybe I'll give Nick Mowbray a call and have him on the show to discuss why they're building it in Los Angeles and not in New Zealand. Another one from Kikila. If you were to get Roger Douglas, get him on to outline what he was unable to implement, and if it had, where would we be today? Those are good questions. Wonder where we would be. For any politician, what is it that they do differently, and what role do they think they've played in the decline that is happening? Every politician you speak to has played some role in that decline, either by doing nothing or actually stuffing up. And you did right on that, Kikila. Any minister that comes on, without divulging personal info, what future have their own kids been able to achieve given the declining state of New Zealand? Another good question. Any Minister of Immigration, how do they ensure we don't end up with people that will never become net taxpayers because the jobs they fill just won't end up paying enough for them to become self-sufficient? And ever since the creation of the welfare state, we've only created more beneficiaries. How are we really going to break the back of the increasing number of families who will always rely on the state? And why don't politicians promote a drill, mine, sell attitude that would make us rich rather than just growing the risk, compliance, health and safety and audit professions? And can we really fight globalism as a large proportion of the population weren't born here and we give out visas really easily and most people have dual citizenship, so they seem themselves as global citizens rather than New Zealanders? Apologies for the diatribe. It's all a bit disjointed, but I'm on a small device with one hand. Great to see you doing so well. All the best to you and yours. Thanks so much for that, Kokila. Those are really well thought out questions. Eileen asks, I'm really confused now. You say not to vote for the minority parties, but we can't trust Labour or National. So how do we turn this craziness around? Would appreciate an answer. Eileen, I did give an answer in last week's show. I said that the only way that we can get rid of ourselves of the Labour Party and the government is to vote for either National or ACT or New Zealand First. Every other minor party has no chance of making the threshold, and that's my advice. Pick one of those three for your party vote. Do whatever you want with your electorate vote. Bobby says, another great session with Cam. Maybe focus on the mushrooms, i.e. greenies next week. We'll have my popcorn at the ready. Helen writes, Dear Cam, I've honestly learnt more from listening to you and your guests than I ever learnt from Paul Spooner during New Zealand Society lectures. Love the content and am buoyed to hear that politically opposed commentators can have a civil exchange of ideas. Although I don't ever believe the left will change their cry of change through conflict. Listening to your interview on the 10th of August, it seemed you were much more enamoured to find common ground than your unionist counterpart. How can we claim back the centre-right when we Conservatives always look for peace and compromise to get it? Kia kaha, Helen. And now a poem, Political Drifters. Something new for the crunch. I hope you enjoy this. Oh, please wake up to the shifting landscape as we near this historic election. People's power in action, and many new honest candidates are gaining selection. They are unknown to the faithful that still put their trust in the red, blue, yellow and green. The tsunami of voters pushing this new wave of candidates to flush the crooks will be seen. A new phase is happening to regain our country and democracy with a massive beehive rejection. People are wary to trust our Winston, but he has experience and wisdom by the ton. Combining with a lady ex-police officer of substance means that laws will be properly done. New Zealand First has the ability to form a new government and work with others to achieve a complete reset, to regain our democracy and show the world that people's power can overcome the WEF. You bet, scrape off the dross and elect a new boss with a brand new government under the sun. 80-odd years of political lies and corruption, fooling the voters of yellow, blue, red and green. Promises for everything, more lies than blowflies from the smiling snake oil crooks that are seen. Using smoke and mirrors to cover government bookworking errors, voters have no idea of our huge debt, billions borrowed for a COVID fiasco to bankrupt, scare and control us by secret fat cats you can bet. All will change in November when this bunch of crooks in media will be crushed and swept clean. What a brilliant poem, Tony. I appreciate you sending that in. Just listened to a great interview with Sandra Gowdy. I record she was the only person to speak out and say she wasn't getting the COVID jab and put up with inane media harassment. She was an inspiration to many at the time and still. Her comments on the Green Party are so true, and her explanation of how the unused minor party votes are allocated are extremely enlightening. That needs to be broadcast far and wide before this election. We need to hear more from Sandra and any other common sense Kiwis you can find. And that's from Sue. And now Lynn writes, I've just discovered Reality Check Radio and want to thank you all for what you are doing. I know of Cam through my regular reading of the BFD, and so far I agree with him 100%. I am well read on what is going on in New Zealand and the world in general, and have lost friends, a consequence of Ardern's brutal regime, who consider me a conspiracy theorist. I can't talk to them anymore, as I know I'm a factualist. Thanks to Cam and people like him, I have gained new and better informed, like-minded friends. So amidst all my losses, I have made some good, loyal friends. I am a pensioner in New Zealand and struggling to survive under the situation caused by Labour, and likely continued by National, whom I hope win in October, not because I want them, but because I despise Labour. I've been a Labour voter all my life and briefly a member in New Zealand, and I'm embarrassed to admit it. Anyway, the point of this is to thank you for saying what needs to be said. With all this adversity going on, it must be an uphill battle for you, and I feel despondent that we are losing the battle. I know where this will likely end up. And Lynn, don't lose hope. It might be a battle, but it's a battle that can be won, but you have to want to fight. Ross writes, Hi team, listening to Cam talking about illegal firearms. Do I remember correctly that a whole lot of handed-in firearms were stolen, which led to the increase in firearm violence? I'm not sure where you heard that, Ross, but I haven't heard that, and I'm pretty well connected in what's happening. But the point is that gang members never handed in their guns. They never will register them, and they're criminals. That's why they're criminals. And the register and police action is ever going to stop that. Graham writes, number one question to ask any politician now, given what we know. Are you in any way affiliated with or seeking to be affiliated with the World Economic Forum? If the answer is yes, as in Luxon's case, as well as Chris Hipkins, then my answer is hell no. These people are traitors to our country, and a vote for anybody that is affiliated with the WEF is practically a vote for further economic destruction as prescribed by the WEF. Their objective is that you will own nothing and be happy, a classic communist outlook. And we all know, thanks to the lessons from history, where this leads us. I can assure you, you will own nothing. That part is true, but you will most definitely also not be happy. Ultimately, when they have taken everything from you, you will have nothing but your life to give, and they will take that from you too. Get rid of any and all politicians that advocate for the WEF, WHO, and the United Nations. Now, Graham, those are good points that you say, and it's often said that people vote for socialism, and you vote them in, but you have to fight your way out of it. Another long email, very long email, from Tracy. You mentioned reality a few times and living in reality in response to my email in support of newer small parties. I've just listened to a show where you suggest our strategy be infiltrating parties and making a difference from within. Is that your hopium? How did that work for people coerced into taking a jab? People who tried to make a stand from within organizations for their human rights. They either got threatened with job loss or lost their jobs. You were talking about standing up in one breath and sitting down at a table where you have to go along or you are gone. How did the peaceful protesters to our government feel when arriving in Wellington and Picton and they got told they would not be talked to by any of the current politicians and all those politicians agreed? And then you say vote for a party that does uphold rights and freedoms. You seem to want real change in New Zealand and acknowledge our need for that, and then with the next breath you toe the party line. Maybe your 40 years in this game is having you see the trees and not the forest. The die is cast with our major and current parties. The issues are far more numerous in this election than in any of previous years. No current party in our government is opposing the many things our country is changing over. And we are losing our country. You have not acknowledged that. A vote for any current major party is not going to address what New Zealand needs to be the beautiful Kiwiana of hard-working people with damn good work ethic, taking the piss and having a laugh 2 degrees of separation place I grew up in. Imagine, Cam, if people realised that and took their 2 ticks and voted for a party and a candidate that stood for things that are important, like human rights and establishing a constitution protecting them, like rebuilding New Zealand infrastructure and making New Zealand less dependent on overseas, support for our world-best farmers and removing restrictions and useless taxes for them, and being truthful about CO2 and methane, free speech, letting women speak and having safe spaces for women and girls and women by criminalising, again, flashers and peeping toms who now have free entry into their private spaces. Equality for every New Zealander in this very blended country. Decentralising government, having money stay local where local areas can decide how it's spent in their best interests without the top-heavy fees and wages of a centralised government having accountability for spending and actions. Recognising our health system is understaffed, farmer-led and influenced. No longer having a government pushing through laws with either no referendum or going against what most New Zealanders want with urgency. Acknowledging the increase in drug abuse for our young people, especially in small towns, stopping untrue biased data to push through climate change controls and measures. The issues are many and varied. Is it true that over 20% of New Zealanders think they have to vote for a bigger party as their only viable option? Is it true that, like in my family, where there are 5 people eligible to vote and 3 are not registered and don't want to vote because they don't see the point? That's 60% of the voters in my family. I try to use good arguments to encourage them registering before September the 10th, but they seem apathetic. Just like when protesting against government overreach, more people I knew and that agreed with protesters stayed at home than those that attended the protests. Government change could come in those in my family and other New Zealanders registered to vote and voted for a party that shares their views. Our biggest bet is to try to persuade those that aren't registered to do so and use our vote for major clean-out, because nothing will change between Labour and National and their coalition partners. They're on the same road for New Zealand to overseas rule and control. One is the slow lane and one is the fast lane, and both lanes are packed with potholes. To get our country back, we need to change the way we think about our vote. The Netherlands did it. A quote from a guest on your show of 18th August, when you have a passion and a forbearance, you can achieve anything. Thanks for that. Don't we Kiwis love an underdog? And don't tell us we can't do something. That just makes us more determined. We know we need to change. I hear that. We need a big change in our government to make any difference. Acknowledging that is the first step. The second change is how we use our vote. It's either for real change or status quo. In the end, New Zealand decides. The day before the election, not too late. The day after is. And those that aren't registered vote need a kick up the arse. And dare I mention, having people there on the day making sure the count is true. South Island farming towns voting Labour in such numbers. There are many questions on the last election. We need to make sure we have people in those voting booths verifying the vote. There was a Substack article on our vote counting process here in New Zealand. It's a bit of a shambles, and there are no clear records. I have many questions, but I digress. Finally, to ask for interview suggestions, Leighton Baker and Dr. Wendy Gillespie. Have a great day. Thanks. Tracy. Bruce has a short suggestion for a guest. He says, give this guy a call and see if you'd like to interview him on your show. Colin Whiteman. We might do that, Bruce. Now a little bit of negative feedback. Hi, Cam. Enjoy listening to your new way with people, but could you please let the guest speak without you putting your opinion forward? You'll overcome that urge to speak and then you'll be amazing. P.S. I think you might favour Winston a wee bit. It seems to be coming through. Thanks heaps. An anonymous commenter says, Sandra Gowdy is a legend. Another anonymous commenter says, enjoyed listening to you and Sandra. Thanks, Cam. Gayleen says, great hearing Sandra on Cam's time slot today. Thumbs up. Looking forward to her returning and sharing her very clear, genuine, no-nonsense views. Thanks for having her on, Cam. Anonymous says, Sandra Gowdy was awesome. Rosa and Will add, we've just listened to the Sandra Gowdy interview, Cam. Well done. I loved her the moment she stood up and said, my body, my choice, and annihilated that reporter, a brave woman. We also loved your comment, re the police coming to your door. We did the same to the statistics lady. No trespassing. Small steps. Another anonymous commenter on Sandra Gowdy says the Sandra Gowdy interview with Cam was absolutely rocked. We 100% need more people like Sandra to stand up and speak out. Thank you, Cam. I'm so glad you're on RCR bringing the political truth bombs. Keep them coming. I follow you on X too, yet due to being a target of the corrupt New Zealand control freaks for being over target, calling out ahead of time events that I saw were due to happen with warnings to the New Zealand public prior to the mass purge of Twitter and getting taken down at the same time as Trump. I've still not been given my old account back. It has taken until a few weeks ago for me to successfully create a new account that I now keep a low profile with. A big shout out to all the strong warriors standing up to fight for New Zealand. This war we are in, and it have been for much longer than most realise, is taking us to the precipice of change. Keep the faith. We are in fact winning, and the best really is yet to come. Another anonymous commenter adds, hi RCR, just wanted to say thanks for discussing the wasted votes knowledge with Sandra Gowdy on Cam Slater's political discussions. I so appreciate this discussion in view of our election in October. Sandra, I was so impressed with you standing up against the media about your freedom of choice. Thank you for educating us, Cam Slater and Sandra Gowdy, about our throwaway votes if we voted for parties that will not get over 5%. Love the discussion that our political parties uphold the human rights for all New Zealanders. Thank you. Now some comments about Simon Lusk, my political tragic from last week. Phew, Cam, Simon Lusk sure does have his head in the sand regarding American politics. Well, that's one of the things that Simon and I disagree with constantly, but it's important to share other people's points of view so you can get a better understanding. Afternoon, Cam. Interesting conversation with Lusk. My first impression of Ardern was dangerous. How right I turned out to be. Luxon comes across as too woke. At this stage, Winston will get my vote. Never voted for him before. Last time I voted ACT, but Seymour isn't the man I thought he was. And that was from Diane. Carolyn adds, I'm turning you off. Who is that cretin you are interviewing who is praising Comrade Ardern, the author of all our problems? I feel like vomiting. The guy is sick in the head. I am disappointed in you, Cam, as I usually enjoy our interviews. Praise for Biden and the two Obama blokes? Come on. Well, Carolyn, you're probably not listening, but I had a message for you in my monologue at the start of the show, and I hope you do listen and take that on board. Mike says, hi, Cam. As you know, I love your show and think you're on the right track politically. Re Winston and New Zealand First. Your last show, 17th of August, you had a guy on whose name I can't remember. I think it was Simon Lusk. And he was saying what a nice person Jack Boot was. Has he even watched this psychopath in action? She sat there smiling and admitted that she was creating a two-tier society where there were vaxxed and non-vaxxed, and the non-vaxxed would suffer. She knew what she was doing all the way through, and as far as I'm concerned, worse than Hitler. At least he did his genocide openly, and everyone knew. Jack Boot killed people with a smile on her face and told everyone to be kind. Your mate can have his opinion and have the right to share it on the radio with you, but I don't agree with him and never will. Cheers, Mike. And you've got the right attitude there, Mike. We don't have to agree with people's points of view, but it pays to listen to them so we can understand how other people think. Now some comments about Rob Ballantyne, the New Zealand First candidate from Rangitata. Thumbs up from Anon. Another anonymous commenter. Hi, Cam. I really enjoyed your interviews today with Sandra G and Rob B while I was chopping firewood ahead of yet another deluge down here tonight in Gisborne. I am almost convinced to vote Winston. Just need to check out the local candidate. Excellent convo with Rob, swing voter here from Anonymous. Another anonymous commenter. What a great interview with Rob Ballantyne. I loved what he had to say. I'm also stealing Cam's woke Womble's phrase. I'm sharing the interview with all my farming mates. And finally, a comment on Cam's buddies. This caller you're talking to saying born again Christian, WTF, I won't say that out loud what it means. Does that have to do with anything, Anon? Well, people are entitled to their views, and that was Jack who said that. And it's kind of interesting because Jack has lunch every Monday with a bunch of born-again Christians. So I'm not sure exactly what he was meaning, but it's his opinion, and he's entitled to it. And that's the mailbag for this week, including that fabulous poem. And I'm not sure my rendition of it with my dulcet tones gave it any justice. But if there's a clamour out there for that to be released as a shareable, I'm pretty sure the tech team at Reality Check Radio will create that for everyone to listen to. Thanks so much for your feedback. I always appreciate it.
This is The Crunch with Cam Slater. Conversations with a side of controversy, right here on RCR.
Right, that's it for The Crunch this week. Never before has free and independent media been so important. And that's why I'm backing guys like Rukshan, Avi, and Ezra. They truly do speak truth to power. I hope you can join us in Auckland and Wellington. I'll be there with the three amigos. It's been a real pleasure having you all back this week. I'm loving the feedback and really enjoying talking to so many people sharing their thoughts on politics and everything in between. There is plenty more in this election campaign that we need to crunch into. So a big shout out to you all, and thanks for listening and having faith in me as we continue to explore this beautiful game of politics. Don't forget email suggestions to inbox@realitycheck.radio for people for me to interview, and let's make this show the best political show in New Zealand. Stay tuned for a breakfast show repeat coming up next, with features including Money Talks with my good buddy Farzan Irani and Perigo's perspective with the one and only Lindsay Perigo. I look forward to having you join me again next Thursday at 4 p.m. for The Crunch with Cam Slater.
You've been listening to The Crunch with Cam Slater. Remember, you can check out the replays for today's show on our website at www.realitycheck.radio/replays. Tune in every Thursday at 4 p.m. for more with Cam Slater, right here on RCR, Reality Check Radio.